My Lords, if there is a division in the House, the committee will adjourn for 10 minutes.
Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Amendment, EU Exit Regulations 2019. Lord Gardner of Kimball.
My Lords, the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Amendment, EU Exit Regulations 2019 groups elements of 6 policy regimes: natural mineral waters, spirit drinks, food labelling, wines, genetically modified organisms and animal imports. The purpose of this statutory instrument is to make purely technical and operability corrections, ensuring that these regimes continue to function as intended. These corrections deal with removing or amending references to EU directives, removing or amending EU references, converting EU procedures to UK procedures, and transferring EU functions to the UK. Lords, in the case of natural mineral waters, the instrument also allows recognition of existing natural mineral waters from the EU, Iceland and Norway to continue on a transitional provision for at least 6 months, thereby maintaining the status quo immediately before exit day. This instrument also provides power to the Secretary of State to withdraw recognition of existing EU natural mineral waters after a period of notice if the EU was not to reciprocate and recognise UK natural mineral waters. Of course, we do hope that the EU will recognise our own mineral waters in good faith, as indeed we are doing. My Lords, with the exception of the Secretary of State's powers over recognition of natural mineral waters, this instrument, as I say, makes no further substantive changes. But so far as the provision on existing natural mineral waters, which obtained recognition in or by a member state in the EEA, would not have the right to be legally sold in England, irrespective of the Secretary of State's powers to regulate this field. This will lead to both restricted consumer choice in the UK, where 1 in 3 bottles of natural mineral water are of EU origin, and changes to prices of the product due to market forces. So I believe that we have taken a very pragmatic view on that matter, and it's necessary we do so. My Lords, the statutory instrument will also ensure that we have a fully functioning scheme for spirit drinks geographical indications, allowing us to register and amend applications. This is, of course, particularly important for Scotch whisky, which in 2018 had a record of £4.7 billion worth in exports. Although these exports would not be directly put in jeopardy without this SI, the industry would lose the ability to amend the Scotch whisky technical file to reflect industry practice better. The technical file is the document which provides the technical specifications for products using the Scotch whisky GI name. For example, production process, geographical area, specific labelling rules, and so forth. This SI amends the applicable regulation to transfer functions from the European Commission to the Secretary of State. On food labelling, this SI transfers a series of legislative functions which are currently conferred upon the European Commission so that they will instead be exercisable here in the UK. Transferring the functions mean that we can make important changes concerning how certain pieces of information can be presented to the consumer. These powers currently sit with the European Commission and ensure we would not require new primary legislation to, for example, update the list of allergens that must be labelled on pre-packed food, or change the way nutritional values are presented. My Lords, turning to wine and aromatised wine, the SI also transfers the power to make rules for the production processes used to make aromatised wines, as well as rules on methods of analysis and administrative and physical checks, and transfers powers on wine relating to GI applications from the EU to the Secretary of State. This SI allows us to update laws in relation to the production and analysis arrangements for aromatised wine by means of regulations. It will also enable us to consider applications for new wine GIs and deal with applications to amend and cancel wine GIs on the UK Wines GI Register. Without doing so, key aspects of our wine quality policy would become inoperative, which would put us in breach of the WTO provisions. It also rolls over the framework for how producers protect geographical indications for aromatised wines, as well as the mechanisms to control the production and use of those geographical indications. For genetically modified organisms, my lords, the SI makes purely technical changes to keep legislation operable on exit. There are no, and I emphasise no, policy changes. It makes operability changes to transfer existing powers from the EU to the Secretary of State, thereby allowing the Secretary of State to develop technical statutory guidance on sampling and testing for the presence of GMOs, to amend the threshold above which products must comply with traceability and labelling requirements, and to apply unique identifying codes to GMOs. This will ensure we can continue to enforce the rigorous rules governing genetically modified organisms. Finally, this SI amends animal health provisions. It makes operable provisions relating to the import of cattle semen, pig semen, and horse semen, ova, and embryos. These amendments are purely technical and preserve the current regime for imports and for protecting the UK's biosecurity. The SI also makes minor operability amendments to two other animal health provisions, one laying down a health certificate used to ensure the health status of certain imports of live animals and products of animal origin, and the other making provision for the appropriate UK authority to publish approved lists of border inspection posts relating to the movement of animals and animal products. In both cases, the amendments are minor and technical and do not introduce any new policy. My Lords, DEFRA has consulted with the devolved administrations on the amendments contained in this instrument, and they have consented to its coming into force. This instrument concerns changes for the United Kingdom, except as regards natural minerals water, which only applies to England, and as regards decisions to GMOs, which are a devolved matter for Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. As the natural mineral waters amendments only apply to England, each devolved administration would have to provide their own equivalent amendments to their respective natural mineral waters regulations. We expect the devolved administrations to mirror the same policy position, but to date they have yet to lay their respective provisions in legislation. Amendments made to Regulation EC number 1830/2003 on the traceability and labelling of genetically modified organisms will apply to the UK. They respect that decisions on GMOs are a devolved matter. My Lords, the natural mineral water policy decisions were subject to a public consultation which ran from the 16th of October last year to the 13th of November. DEFRA has engaged all major stakeholders in the process throughout 2018, from individual companies to industry bodies. We've also written to the main stakeholders to explain the implications of this particular instrument. My Lords, these measures will ensure that the policy regimes of natural mineral waters, spirit drinks, food labelling, wine, aromatized wine, GMOs and animal imports remain able to operate. With the exception of natural mineral waters, where we have consulted extensively, this instrument makes technical and operability corrections, ensuring that these regimes continue to function as intended. My Lords, I beg to move.
The question is this motion be agreed to.
I welcome the regulations, and particularly, may I say, given my heritage as born in Edinburgh, particularly pleasing of the Scotch whisky exports, which obviously boost trade for the whole country. From my question earlier this week, my noble friend the Minister will be aware of my interest in traceability and labelling, and unfortunately we didn't have time to explore it then. So I'm grateful for his setting out the thrust of the statutory instrument. My noble friend goes to some length to explain that this statutory instrument is technical in nature and makes no public policy changes, but he will be aware of the fact that the 19th report of the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee, Subcommittee B, states very clearly that they do give rise to issues of public policy likely to be of interest to the House, which is why I'm grateful that we're having the opportunity to debate these today. North Yorkshire is still smarting from the fact that Shepherd's Purse cheese used to produce a very popular cheese called Yorkshire Feta, and clearly it fell foul of the genetic, whatever it's called, the GI, not being produced in Greece. So I think for a time it was called Yorkshire Fettle, and to my embarrassment I'm not quite sure how it's marketed now, but obviously we did fall foul of those. My specific question I'd like to raised with the Minister today relates to really just seeking an assurance that we will continue to follow the cocoa and chocolate products regulations of 2003. I won't blame the government necessarily for the volatility of the pound, but it is a fact that I think we've seen changes to the pound since the result of the referendum was known, and over the last 2 weeks, say, we've seen increasing volatility of the pound. This has huge implications for cocoa and chocolate products. My noble friend will be aware that, for example, without naming a producer necessarily, because there are other products available, but we tend to introduce milk chocolate here with a lower cocoa content and a higher vegetable fat content. I'm just seeking a assurance that we will continue to be aligned with the European Union rules as regards cocoa and chocolate products, and in particular the content of these insofar as these regulations relate to that. Thank you.
I would like to thank my noble friend the Minister for introducing this first of these amendments. I've got 2 issues that I'd like to follow up on, please. One is the first on the geographical indication, and I see in the brief we've got the UK has some 86 product names already in being, and quoted Scotch whisky, Welsh lamb and Cornish pasties. I would love to have had Stilton cheese and Melton Mowbray pork pies in there, coming from the Leicestershire end as I do. My question to the Minister is that there is no way in which this will restrict new products being able to become listed, is there? I don't think there will be, but I'd like to have clarification on that, please. And the second one is looking at the GMOs, and I'm grateful for what he said on that. And indeed the importance of labelling, I quite accept. But again, looking to the future and future development, with the same rigour in being, I trust it will not preclude new developments coming in within the possibilities of future developments of GMOs. And again, I'd like some clarification on that. But having said that, I welcome this amendment.
My Lords, I too would like to thank the Noble Lord the Minister for his characteristically very clear explanation of this SI, and I have just a few queries on which I'd appreciate his assurance. First of all, under Part 4, Regulation 1830/2003, concerning genetically modified organisms, Article 4 refers to amending thresholds for release of GMOs into the environment. Can the Noble Lord the Minister tell us, does the government have any intentions to alter thresholds? Under what circumstances might that be done? And ultimately, who will decide what future thresholds will be? I certainly don't want to preclude novel developments, and I agree with Noble Baroness Byford on that point. And on Part 5, the Commission Decision 2009/821, which refers to border inspection posts and traces the trade control and expert system for notification of imports and so on, can the Noble Lord the Minister tell us How many border inspection posts are there currently? Are there any plans for any more? And can we be assured that the number are adequate to deal with any Brexit scenario that might occur? And secondly, I understand Traces is going to be replaced by a British system. With regard to that replacement, when will that replacement system become operational? It's called, I believe, the Import of Products, Animals, Food and Feed Systems, with the natty acronym IPAFS. But I'd like to ask the Noble Lord, when will that be operational, and particularly, will it be operational by March the 29th?
My Lords, I would also like to thank the Minister for his introduction and for the time of his officials in the briefing. My Lords, this was an SI originally scheduled to be a negative instrument, but after the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee B had completed its sifting process, was upgraded to an affirmative instrument. And this was a wise decision, as there are some significant changes covered in this SI, not least around natural mineral waters, but also around geographical indications and GMOs. My Lords, it is all about environmental protection, food and intellectual property. The last, in particular, will have significant impacts in some areas of the UK. As the Minister says, this is a transfer of functions and there will be mutual recognition between the UK and the EU from day one. However, unless I have misunderstood it, there will be a 6-month transition period during which EU imported mineral waters will not be able to be labelled mineral water and recognised for sale in the UK. These EU mineral waters represent, as the Minister has said, approximately 30% of UK market sales. There will therefore be a gap in the market, which it is unlikely our own UK mineral water bottlers will be able to fill. Our own mineral waters are very specific to geographic areas, Highland Spring, Buxton and Glastonbury Chalice Well being 3. My husband comes from Derbyshire, so my preference is for Buxton when I can get it. If EU Volvic, Evian and Pellegrino mineral waters are not available, the UK consumer may find they are unable to buy an alternative, as demand will outstrip the supply of our own production. At the end of the 6-month transition period, an EU-based mineral water company can reapply for permission to import into the UK. It will be up to the Secretary of State to either withdraw or permit such permission. And again, if I have understood it correctly, if any EU state recognises our UK mineral water, then the Secretary of State cannot withdraw an EU water company's permission. It will be up to his or her discretion. Can the Noble Lord the Minister say whether it is likely that many EU mineral water companies may not bother to reapply? On the upside, if one of the EU countries recognises a UK-based mineral water, then all 27 will have to do the same, and so markets will be opened up. Likewise, if one of the devolved administration permits an EU mineral water company to import its products, then the other 3 will also permit it to be imported. Turning now to the question of geographical indication, or GIs as they are called, and we have had some discussion about this. This is a very wide classification, including Scotch and Irish whisky, Cornish pasties, Wensleydale cheese and Camel Valley wines. These are extremely important to the economy of the areas that produce this fine food and drink. And 7.3 of the explanatory memorandum indicates that there will be no change to description and labelling. And I'm looking to the Minister to give reassurance that the status of iconic GIs will not be diminished but protected after we have left the EU. The labelling of local produce is extremely important, especially to the farming community, where lamb and beef in particular command a high price if they come from certain breeds and areas of the country, such as salt marsh Welsh lamb. Whilst on the subject of food labelling, this is of particular interest to me as someone who reads all the labels of food that contain more than one product. As a lifelong celiac, I am looking for wheat-based and gluten-containing products in everything. The current labelling system, whereby allergens are highlighted in bold, is extremely useful, as the allergens leap out at you and you do not have to read in depth all the ingredients on the reverse. In terms of gluten, there is often a gluten-free crossed grain symbol on the front of the product. Thus, I can safely buy sausages from 2 well-known food retailers without having to refer to the small print on the back. I will not be alone in meticulously reading ingredient labels. I would like to ask the Noble Lord the Minister to give his reassurance that there will be no watering down of these regulations once exit day has passed. For some, as we all know, poor labelling has become a matter of life or death. A review of labelling will need to ensure more stringent regulations, not a watering down of existing ones.
My Lords, I thank the Noble Lord the Minister for his introduction this afternoon and for the courtesy of meeting with us beforehand. And, my Lords, this SI covers a wide range of issues which do seem to have all the hallmarks of a rather hurried amalgamation of outstanding issues which have to be cleared before Brexit Day. And I do hope that stakeholders and businesses who have an interest in the content of this can find them buried away in an SI with its rather unenlightening title of intellectual property, which seems to cover a lot of sins within the SI which are not immediately obvious. My Lords, I would also like to make the point that the amendments to Commission 2009-821 EC concerning border inspection posts, and those indeed referring to health certificates, I would have thought sensibly should have been dealt with as part of the earlier SI that we dealt with on import and trade in animals and animal products, and I'm not sure why they've been tagged on in this way. But incidentally, on this subject, I am very grateful to the Noble Lord the Minister for writing a follow-up letter following the questions raised by my noble friend Lord Knight and others when we dealt with that more substantial SI a couple of weeks ago. And I am aware that the government have published technical information today on the issue of imports between Northern Ireland and the Republic. But in the case of animals crossing the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, the letter, in other words, those being exported, the letter did confirm the rather alarming fact that without a deal, all animals seeking to enter the EU, i.e. to enter the Republic of Ireland, would have to do so via an EU border inspection post with locations which have yet to be decided. And your letter also confirmed that whilst the government continues to engage constructively with Ireland, and indeed that's been a common theme that we've heard in other debates around SIs, there are in fact restrictions on the UK having bilateral discussions with EU member states. So there's only a very limited amount of progress that can be made between the UK and the Republic of Ireland at this point. So, my Lords, I don't want to dwell too much on this today because I know it's not the main subject of the SIs, but I would just like to say that this seems to me to be extremely unsatisfactory for farmers in Northern Ireland who will face extreme restrictions on exporting to the south. And I hope that the Minister can provide some reassurance to those farmers that steps are being taken very, very urgently to make sure that the border inspection posts and all other means to ease that export are being put in place as soon as possible. So, my Lords, if I turn now to the details of the SI before us today, as the noble lady, I think it was Baroness Mackintosh, said, this SI was drawn to the special attention of the House by Scrutiny Subcommittee B. And I agree with the noble lady that it does indeed raise important issues of public policy, particularly as it affects consumers' rights and customer choice. And I hadn't picked up the issue of chocolate, but now she's raised that question, I too would like to know whether or not the price and availability of cocoa and chocolate is going to be affected, because I certainly have a great interest in the outcome of that answer from the Minister. But if I go on now to talk about natural mineral water, and as has been said, the SI sets out new regulations for accrediting natural mineral water, and As the explanatory memorandum sets out, the amendments will maintain the existing recognition of mineral waters from the EU, Iceland and Norway, which would indeed ensure market stability, continued trade and consumer choice. And given that we export mineral water to the EU and import mineral water from the EU, this is obviously a sensible provision. But, my Lords, the SI also seems to contain an open threat, which I haven't seen before in SIs dealing with traded goods, because it says that if the Secretary of State finds that there is at least one UK mineral water that is not being recognised by a member state in the EU, then all accreditations for all EU mineral waters in the UK will cease effectively forthwith. And the effect of this would be that all EU mineral waters, including some very big brands that have been referred to, would not be able to be sold in the UK as natural mineral water. So, can I ask the Minister, a more general point, is this a negotiating tactic that has been adopted more widely? And is this the way we're going to do our future trade talks with the EU? Because there are consequences, I think, to this tit-for-tat approach. And I just would like to be clear, have the consequences been considered and discussed with the UK mineral water exporters? And I understand that they don't export as much as we import, but they would no doubt find that all their export opportunities to the EU would be cut off if we operated that tit-for-tat process. Is this a tactic with which they agree? And has indeed any consideration been given to the impact that this would have on consumer choice? We all might say that we shouldn't be importing water, particularly not water in plastic bottles, from the EU or anywhere else. And I think the Noble Lord, when we were talking before, mentioned that London Tap was a very fine brand, and I think we all should be drinking that. But there is an issue about consumer choice, and I think if we ask consumers, they all have their very strong preferences and preferred brands, and it's important that we're clear about the consequences of that. And also, I would like to ask, Noble Lord's Minister said that this is a devolved issue, and in fact this particular provision is England only. So could we find, for example, that Evian water was available in Scotland and Wales but not in England? I think the Noble Lord probably has an answer to that, but I think it's important that that is recorded so we're clear on the actual legal position. My Lords, if I now turn to the protection of geographical indications of spirit drinks, the regulations transfer authority for registering geographical indication from the EU to the Secretary of State, as the Noble Lord has said. And I think I'm right in saying that there's been some sensitivity around these designations in the EU in the past, and certainly they have seen as being operating the rules in quite a stringent way, so it's not easy to get a geographical indication, and maybe that's a good thing. But can I ask the Noble Lord the Minister what types of objections to GI status we would be considering under the new regime? Are they going to be similarly stringent in the way that the EU currently operate those indications, or are we envisaging relaxing the rules in some way? And if we did have different rules in the UK to the ones that would continue to be operated in the EU, would it have an effect, or could it potentially have an effect, on the export of market to the export market of indeed our drinks producers? So if we were more relaxed about it and then suddenly wanted to export Scotch whisky, could they say that because we haven't abided by the EU standards of GIs, that they were no longer going to import it into the EU? So there are obviously advantages to expanding our GIs, and to, as I think Noble Lady Bakewell was saying, to celebrating our regional and local provenance. And I think we all understand how advantageous that would be in many ways. But what we don't want to do is to cut off our nose to spite our face and find that our exports are damaged in some way. And can I also ask which organisations will be expected to advise the Secretary of State on the validity of any new applications? So is there, which authoritative body, given that it isn't, I guess, going to actually be the Secretary of State, is going to be the experts on applications with geographical indications. My Lords, if I turn to the amendments on food labelling, the Secretary of State is given new powers to specify portion size and dietary recommendations on food labels. And the EM also makes it clear that it would be given greater power to update the list of allergens on the label. And my Lords, clearly this would be welcome in many regards, as we need to give consumers better information and better advice. But can I ask the Minister whether the consequences of a separate UK labelling regime have been discussed with the food industry? Have they got concerns that this might add to the level of regulation, that they may be asked to have more different labelling for different markets? And I wonder what they felt about the extent to which they would like to have a uniform system for labelling, or are prepared to have a specific bespoke UK labelling system. Finally, my Lords, I would also like to ask about genetically modified organisms, and several other noble lords have raised this as well. And the proposals give the Secretary of State new powers to amend the threshold below which products containing GMOs don't need to be labelled. And the EM goes on to say that in doing so, Secretary of State is required to consult the relevant Food Standards Authority. The Minister will know that this is a very sensitive subject with a great deal of public concern, so it is important that we receive reassurance about the Secretary of State's motives in seeking these changes. In the explanatory memorandum, it says that companies and a selection of NGOs and campaign groups were consulted and no significant concerns were raised. Can I ask the Minister what that means in practice? Did it mean that they supported the proposals? And can I also make the point that if there were to be a change in this policy in the future, I would hope that there would be a wider public consultation on this issue, given the sensitivities around it, rather than just with a food standards body, which is what's implied in the SI as it stands. And can I also ask what practical considerations have been given for this being an England-only regulation, which means that the devolved nations could take a different view, leading to separate food labelling policies on this issue across the 4 nations, again with all the complications that could be for the business sector and for food producers. So I do look forward to the Minister's response on these issues.
My Lords, I'm most grateful for all the comments that have been made, and I agree that they cover, in terms of beyond the statutory instruments, which, as I say, are to enable regimes to be operable, some very important subject matters. I can say immediately to my noble friend Lady Mackintosh and the noble Baroness Lady Jones of Whitchurch, so far as cocoa and chocolate products are concerned, yes, we will continue to follow the 2003 cocoa and chocolate regulations. Of course, the whole proposal of beyond this afternoon's debate is that we are not seeking, with these SIs coming through the Withdrawal Act, to have any policy changes at all, and we will continue with that. On the question of a number of points that were made on geographical indications, I entirely agree with my noble friend, Lady Byford, that perhaps of the 86, Stilton was most definitely worthy of comment, but I think that all of us and beyond recognise that we have some extraordinarily wonderful produce in this country from all parts of the United Kingdom, and we should celebrate them. And I would like to assure your lordships that the GI schemes that will come into force in the UK on the day we leave the EU will guarantee that UK GIs remain fully protected in the UK. There's absolutely no question that suddenly these extraordinarily important produce would have to share their centuries-old heritage with others. I should also say that the new GI legislation, which will be forthcoming, will also ensure that the UK continues to comply with the obligations as a member of the World Trade Organization, including under the TRIPS agreement on intellectual property, and it's vital that empowering the UK to strike new trade deals with other countries, a number of which are due to come into force on exit day. So we are very clear that we wish to, yes, not only cherish those GIs that we have, but of course I see every merit, and I'm sure this is the case around the world, ensuring that there is scope for new produce coming forward as celebration of wherever it is around the world, and we should do so. On the issue of a number of points came up on GMOs, and I absolutely understand that this is an area that, although, as I say, this is about operability, this is an area that a number of your lordships raised more generally. And I should say, and I think it was important, an important point was made about the ability to make changes to allow the UK to keep pace with technological advances, changes in labelling requirements in the international arena. Again, it's very important that we're in a position through this SI, but beyond, to ensure that we are able to attend to any necessary changes. And just to say that the devolved administrations may make their own amendments, or, as we've seen very often with a lot of these SIs, and I think this will continue, that the Secretary of State may do so on DA's behalf with their agreement. On the question of expertise and how that would be, and the Noble Baroness Lady Jones of Whitchurch, I think, particularly raised this, but a number of your lordships, I know the Noble Lord Trees, and my noble friend Lady Byford particularly raised also GMOs, as I know did I think the Noble Baroness Lady Bakewell as well. The current situation is that the European Food Standards Agency issues an opinion on an application. For the UK, the EFSA opinion is considered by ACRE, the Advisory Committee on Releases to the Environment. ACRE is a statutory body of experts providing independent scientific advice to UK ministers on potential risks to the environment which may be caused by any GMO. In emphasis of the importance of the scientists involved, ACRE comprises 9 independent scientists with expertise in a range of disciplines, including ecology, microbiology and entomology, soil biology and biochemistry, plant pathology, genetics and plant biochemistry, medical microbiology and human infection, molecular biology, genomic systems biology and synthetic biology. The Food Standards Agency considers the application in terms of safety as food and feed. ACRE's advice informs the UK vote from the environmental perspective. So that is how it has been, and that expert body, the statutory body of experts. Going forward, of course, EFSA's opinions are publicly available, so we will continue to have access to them. And of course, ACRE will continue to advise the UK government on the environmental aspects of applications made for example, any GM crop. The final decision will be made now, as I say, in the United Kingdom. But I do want to emphasise that this is an area on which the government and this government places the greatest importance on environmental protection, yes, and all of it based, as I say, on independent scientific experts of the range. I'm sorry it took a little time, but I wanted your lordships to know that this was a range of expertise in almost every area that could be interconnected with these matters. On the question of, and the Noble Lord Trees raised this, and in terms of inspections, in terms of imports, the only additional, because in terms of arrangements with the EU. We have decided imports from the EU, day one, the risk will not change. So although there may be not reciprocity, we have decided that we will not be putting up or changing our arrangements because we do not believe there are any new risks to UK biosecurity. The only additional inspections we will have in terms of imports will apply to live animals, animal products and high-risk food and feed not of animal origin that originate from a third country and travel through the EU before arriving in the UK. We're considering options to minimise regulatory duplication for transits entering the UK via the EU, and I can confirm that there will be no change to the level of expertise required at our UK BIPs. I think it's very important, again, that we're conscious of a number of things, which is obviously we want a flow of trade, but we need to base all our judgments on biosecurity risk as well. And the Chief Veterinary Officer, who is constantly advising me and the government on these matters, is absolutely clear that the risk, there is not a risk in changing our arrangements. A number of other points that came up in terms of the noble Baroness Lady Jones of Whitchurch and the noble Lord Trees. And I absolutely understand the sensitivities of the Northern Ireland issue. I would emphasise we remain focused on securing a deal that would guarantee no hard border. We've always been clear that the unique and social, political and economic circumstances of Northern Ireland must be reflected in any arrangements that could apply in a no-deal scenario. In the event of a no-deal, we would do everything possible to avoid a hard border between the North and the Republic and to uphold the Good Friday Agreement. Therefore, today we're confirming a unilateral approach to checks, processes and tariffs to do all we can to avoid a hard border. This approach will, of course, be temporary, but in the case of a no-deal, we would not introduce any new checks or controls on goods crossing from Ireland to Northern Ireland, including any new customs declarations for goods. I obviously do hope very much that with the EU and the Republic that the same will be reflected, but as I said in questions earlier in the week, a deal that involves two parties. I think that we have, in making that pragmatic decision, I think that we have behaved correctly. And turning to the natural mineral waters issue again, I think we've been very pragmatic, my lords. We have been told that there will not be reciprocity, but we took the view that we would continue to accept EU natural mineral waters, yes, recognising consumer choice, but also recognising that this was a more pragmatic approach. And I think it's very important that that is recognised. So there is absolutely no intention of some trade war or some sort of dispute that we ever want to see emerge. We're very clear that this is has the ability, the Secretariat has the ability to withdraw recognition, but in practical terms, a collaborative approach around all home countries, and I think this is the point that the noble Baroness Lady Jones of Whitchurch was quite rightly raising, that the whole essence of what we've seen with these SIs and beyond has been a very collaborative approach between all home countries. And I think that, and the case is, I'm sure all home countries would need to agree that after the guaranteed first 6 months of a rolled over recognition, to decide whether there was a time, and I hope this won't be the case, but it was the provision that there might be a time to give notice as stated in the instrument, and how long that notice would be. And I think, again, I would say the UK has been very pragmatic and is certainly not seeking to have anything other than a meaningful and strong relationship, in this case, the drinking of natural mineral water, although I absolutely endorse what the noble Baroness Lady Jones of Whitchurch has said about, I find it curious how much water we are importing and the water miles of importing water, when we have Buxton water, when we have Highland spring water, when we have Welsh water, and Harrogate spring water. Thank you to my noble friend. And I don't say this to encourage a feeling of I'm against EU produce, but I do, however, think that the British government has made a very pragmatic approach to an issue that I very much hope doesn't transpire, and that we can find satisfactory arrangements. I'm looking now at the points that the noble Baroness Lady Bakewell raised. Yes, I very much hope that in the issue of trade and so forth, that EU companies will consider, if it was to come to the case, to apply. I mean, I think the government is a supporter of consumer choice. I think that's very important. I am mindful, however, what I have said about London tap water and other wonderful waters from all parts of the United Kingdom. I'm looking at the noble lord, thinking about I've had some Northumbria very fine water as well. So around our country we have these great examples. On the issue of labelling, I think that one of the issues, and as we know with the death of Natasha, one of the things the Secretary of State embarked upon was a consultation on this, so that we have an ability for people to know much more about what is on made-up food. And a lot of this is now happening, thank goodness, more voluntarily, but we are having this consultation because we take it very seriously about the need for consumers to have all the information they desire and need, and that is an important part of that. On the issue of food labelling, this issue, this instrument does not amend food labelling rules. It's not intended to. It's about temporary fixes and operability. On the issue of Northern Ireland borders and border inspection posts, only a limited range of goods will need to enter the UK, including the Northern Ireland, through a border inspection post. The purpose is to protect human, animal and plant health after we've left. In a no-deal scenario, animals and animal products from countries outside the EU would need to enter Northern Ireland through a UK border inspection post. That is, as is the case now. And we will always keep our biosecurity analysed in terms of the risk. Clearly, we are also committed as a government to continue the discussions with the Commission and the Irish government to agree jointly long-term measures to avoid what we so desire, avoid a hard border, and to limit the impact on life on the island of Ireland, which is so absolutely crucial. My Lords, I am looking to see whether there were other key points, and I think there may be other key points. The Noble Lord Trees and BIP capacity, the consideration that it is sufficient. There are 25 UK BIPs, estimate an extra 8,000 checks at UK BIPs. Port health authorities, and I have quizzed this myself, have confirmed they are able to meet that extra demand with existing food inspectors. Ports are developing more capacity to deal with that. And I should say, I know that work is very much in progress at Calais, for instance, at Coquel. So there is a lot of work going on, my Lords. My Lords, I am looking to see whether there are any key other points that I should raise. On the issue of food labelling, again, Noble Baroness Lady Jones, on the issue of consultation, DEFRA has raised stakeholder awareness of the food labelling technical notices of last September, raised awareness of the amending of food labelling laws consultation, which I've mentioned. DEFRA and ministers have also engaged many times with key stakeholders externally to the consultation. All of the areas, the instrument is about technical operability with the exception of the natural mineral waters. All of these areas are technical. So on the precise instrument, the answer is this was not necessary. But I would like to say, and perhaps I could write to Noble Lords, there are many instances of these areas where there is ongoing engagement on spirit and drinks, food labelling, GMOs, animal imports, work with importers, engagement with 300 stakeholders to date, covering 50 events. So beyond these statutory instruments, a very considerable amount of consultation and working with others have been undertaken. The Noble Baroness, and I think this may be the last one, the Noble Baroness Lady Jones of Whitchurch questioned about separate food labelling across the DAs. We have to respect, clearly, the devolved arrangements, and food labelling is devolved. But it is fair to say that all of the 4 parts of the kingdom are working very closely together on these to ensure there is no disruption to the UK internal market in the event of a no-deal scenario, or indeed in the event of any scenario. I think that there is a recognition amongst all parts of the kingdom that the internal market within the UK is tremendously important, and that we should work collaboratively together. And all the evidence I have from all the SIs we've had on these matters and beyond is that sense and pragmatism is prevailing. I will study Hansard again, because there may be some points that in the many questions I've sought to answer, that there are some distinct matters that Noble Lords would like precise or more precise or detailed answers on. Yes.
Lord gathers his final thoughts. It was remiss of me. I should perhaps have, since we strayed into GMOs and the science of GMOs, perhaps I should have declared an interest as the chair of Rothampstead Institute, Rothampton Enterprise, which is part of the Rothampstead Agricultural Research Institute, which does indeed do research into GMOs.
I also am a member of the all-party group Whisky and Food, and do receive hospitality, and did have dinner with a chocolate company which were not concerned by what we discussed today.
Just perhaps by writing, if I could have an answer to the question on traces and the replacement for traces, when that might be operational.
Yes, I will say that IPAFS is... IPAFS has been launched, which is the successor to Traces. It was launched on private beta on the 14th of February for organisations with the greatest need. It will be operable from the day we leave for all third country exports, and what we intend to do with imports from the EU, there will be a separate system with IPAFS coming in to play. We think in the summer. I wouldn't like to give a precise date, but obviously we want this to be a system that is working effectively. And I think what I'd like to do is write to the Noble Lord with a copy to Noble Lords.
My Lord, there is a reason in the Chamber. The committee will adjourn for 10 minutes.
My Lords, I beg to move.
Question that this motion be agreed to. As many of that opinion will say content. The contrary, not content. The contents have it.
Detergents Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2019. Baroness Beer of Norton.
My Lords, the primary aim of these instruments is to amend EU and domestic legislation on detergents to enable their continued operability. Both instruments amend the same EU detergents regulation, and given the close links, they are grouped for this debate. We have worked with the devolved administrations on these instruments. The legislation amended by the Draft Detergents Amendment EU Regulations 2019 is reserved matter. The Draft Detergents Safeguarding Amendment (EU Exit Regulations 2019) relate to devolved matters, and the devolved administrations have consented to that SI. My Lords, these instruments make many amendments, and I will highlight some of them. Noble Lords will not be surprised to learn that they are technical in nature. The draft Detergents Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2019 will ensure the continuation of standards and requirements in relation to the placing on the market of detergents, while ensuring a high degree of protection of the environment and human health. These draft regulations remedy deficiencies that will arise in the retained EU detergents regulation and the implementing domestic regulation, so as to ensure that manufacturers placing detergents and surfactants for detergents on the market in the UK continue to meet all the requirements of the detergents regulations, including composition, which includes strict limits on the permitted level of phosphorus content, labelling, data sheets and testing. Restrictions or bans are imposed on surfactants on grounds of biodegradability. Looking at the SI in more detail, Part 2 of the Draft Detergents Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2019 ensures that Domestic Detergents Regulations 2010 can continue to be enforced by the relevant authorities and that penalties for non-compliance remain in place. Part 3 amends the EU Detergents Regulations to remedy deficiencies, including corrections to references which would have no practical application to the UK after EU exit. For example, Regulations 5 and 6 remove references to the free movement of detergents in the EU internal market and to the Union customs territory in Articles 1 and 2 of the EU regulation. The detergents regulation cross-refer to a number of other pieces of EU legislation, including the biocidal products, cosmetic products classification, labelling and packaging, and REACH regulations, and the Good Laboratory Practice Directive. This instrument amends many of these cross-references, ensuring they are up to date so that they will continue to work on exit day. This instrument also sets out how the returning EU powers, including the decision-making powers currently exercised by the European Commission, will return to the UK after EU exit. The Secretary of State, as the competent authority for detergents in the UK, will exercise those powers, taking expert advice as appropriate. In practice, the work of the competent authority will effectively continue to be undertaken by the Health and Safety Executive, or HSE, under an agency agreement with DEFRA. The HSE's existing capability and capacity can be built upon to take on UK regulatory authority responsibility. However, additional requirements from this SI for the competent authority are minimal. Relevant functions to be transferred to the Secretary of State include the power to consider granting a derogation for a product, Regulations 8 and 9, and the power to determine disputes about testing methods for a product, Regulation 10. The derogation provision has been used only very rarely at EU levels. In the case of disputes about testing methods, a manufacturer may appeal a decision by the Secretary of State to a court. Member States are currently required to notify to the Commission the list of approved laboratories that are authorised to carry out the tests required by the regulation. Through Regulation 11, provision is made so that the tests required by this regulation may be carried out by approved laboratories, and the Secretary of State must publish that list. In practice, the HSE will publish this list. Regulation 12 amends Article 8 on the information to be provided by manufacturers. Article 9.3 requires that manufacturers placing detergent products on the market shall make available an ingredient data sheet, and that Member States may request that such data sheet be made available to a specific public body to which the Member State has assigned the task of providing this information to medical personnel. This article is amended to specifically refer to the National Poisons Information Service, or NPIS, or other such body to which the Secretary of State or the devolved administrations may assign for this purpose. NPIS already undertakes this role across the UK. The power of the Commission to adapt the annexes to the regulation in line with scientific and technical progress is transferred to the Secretary of State in Regulation 16. The Secretary of State will be able to do so by making a statutory instrument. I now turn to the Draft Detergents Safeguarding Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2019. The safeguarding clause in Article 15 of the Detergents Regulation is amended. Currently, Member States may take provisional measures in relation to those detergents which fully comply with the EU regulation, but which nevertheless pose a risk to the safety of humans or of animals or a risk to the environment. Member States intending to use the safeguard clause must immediately inform the Commission documenting their reasons. Regulation 3 amends this Article 15 of the EU Detergents Regulation. The Secretary of State and the devolved administrations, where the matter is devolved, will have the full powers currently held by the European Commission and Member States to initiate urgent, temporary safeguarding action across the UK in relation to detergents. My Lords, although there was no statutory requirement to consult on this instrument, HSE officials have engaged with industry. In March 2018, a round table of one-to-one stakeholder meetings with trade associations was held in relation to chemicals legislation generally. The main TA with an interest in detergents and cleaning products is the United Kingdom Cleaning Products Industry Association, or UKCPI. No particular concerns were expressed at the time in relation to these detergents regulations. The JCSI did not report any concerns with these instruments. The SLSC noted that HSE's responsibilities after EU exit will expand significantly as a result of these and other instruments. It will need to be resourced adequately to carry out its new functions. As I set out earlier, the Health and Safety Executive currently acts on behalf of the Secretary of State, who is the competent authority for detergents legislation, and any additional requirements from this SI are minimal. The SLSC also asked DEFRA about the use of the safeguarding mechanism and whether the fact that the UK will no longer have access to the EU's information sharing systems will mean greater health or environmental risks. The Department responded that while the UK would lose access to information sharing systems, such as the EU's Rapid Reporting and Response System, RAPEX, in practice, the safeguarding mechanism was very rarely used, just twice since 2004, and the impact, therefore, was likely to be low. The UK will still have access to the public available information on RAPEX and to the new product safety base established by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
My Lords, when I came to have a look at these regulations, and I do sympathise with all those ministers who have so many similar sounding ones and you're not quite sure when you pick it up and look at it, a variation of one word between the two here. I was going through thinking, this sounds reasonably sensible overall, but there are one or two things that come out, and the Noble Baroness has touched upon them already, but I will be asking for a little bit of expansion about actually what she's dealing with. Although she said it will be a minimal expansion for the Health and Safety Executive, what exactly does that mean in this context? Minimal, is it a large expansion or just a sort of greater activity occasionally? Because we need to know. It is in the context of, does it have that capacity? Can it do it when it happens? Because, as in the last sentence, indeed, in the when to get it right, the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee, Subcommittee B, says about the what happens when it uses the EU's reporting capacity and the information exchange there. And the government replies, well, it only happens occasionally, so don't worry. My Lords, you would expect anything about safeguarding, if the system is at all sensible, to only happen on very occasion. If the system was so flawed that you needed to use it frequently, one would hope you would change the entire system. It really does need to be something about how we're going to do this, because you're not regulating for something that's happening all the time. It's when something goes wrong. A very minor variation coming in here, ingredients which are normally used are normally safe, something's gone wrong, or some threat happens. That is a very genuine concern, my Lords, because you're not dealing with the everyday. So a little bit more information about how that's working, how, for instance, indeed the 90-day period was chosen actually as being the period that it's appropriate to take action over. Could we have some more information on that, just to put our minds at rest? Because, my Lords, it's not something that's about the mechanical process. It's about something that's gone wrong. Thus, it has to be able to respond and respond quickly and only very occasionally do it. A gap of decades is quite possible on this. Could we just find out how that's going to work and make sure that capacity is there? Because at the moment, it is a very worrying statement. It hasn't happened very often so let's not worry about it. That could be read as that, and I have hope that that is rather, shall we say, a little bit too blunt a way of interpreting, but I would hope there is something that reassures us that you actually have got this capacity, it is available, and if you never need it, great, but it should be there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I welcome the two regulations and also congratulate my noble friend in moving them. Could I just echo the concern that was raised in its report, the 18th report of Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee, Subcommittee B. And it echoes the earlier remarks I made to our noble friend, the Minister, Lord Henley, when he was making comments in a similar statutory instrument, I think 1 or 2 weeks ago, and I thank him for his letter in this regard. And also my noble friend, the Minister, Lord Gardner, who was kind enough to refer to comments about RASAF relating to food safety. And I would like to associate comments made from the Liberal benches, Liberal Democrat benches as well. My concern is that the committee has flagged up a certain, the committee, Subcommittee B, has flagged up, in my view, a possible complacency here. And I welcome the fact that my noble friend, the Minister, has pointed out that there have only been 2 incidents in that time. But I do refer to the additional information which the Department provided in Appendix 1 to Subcommittee B's 18th report. And the direct question, just can my noble friend the Minister assure me that there is no complacency in the Department, that they will respond quickly to any such safeguard being exercised in the future, and also confirm that it is the Government's desire and wish and is actively pursuing our continued access to RAPEX, and indeed other bodies such as the European Chemicals Agency, which operates in this regard the information sharing system for these purposes.
My Lords, can I firstly thank the noble lady, the Minister, for her introduction this afternoon, and also for arranging a very helpful briefing on this SI beforehand. And we accept that these SIs are indeed necessary to ensure the continued operability of the EU-related provisions post-Brexit. However, we are keen to ensure that the transfer of powers to ministers is not used as an excuse to weaken standards and processes. And one way of ensuring this is for the UK to keep pace with EU standards on this matter. These SIs also raise the recurring themes which we've debated several times now of the potential for significant environmental impacts and indeed the need for effective environmental governance, which will be, I suspect, a running theme through today and future SIs as well. And they also raise the recurring issue of resources, in this case for the HSE to carry out its new functions and for the scientific advice and guidance that will be necessary. And most importantly, we share the concern of the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee that without access to the EU's information sharing systems, there will indeed be a greater health or environmental risk. So with this in mind, I have a few specific questions. Firstly, the instruments state, this is a general point, but they state that these provisions offer, quote, a high degree of protection for the environment and human and animal health can be maintained, quote, unquote, after Brexit. But what does this, my Lords, what does this mean in practice? Can the Minister guarantee that there will be the same level of protection that is offered now, given that some of the EU protections that we've been available to us in the past will no longer be there? In the additional information that DEFRA provided to the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee, it stated that in the event of no-deal Brexit, the UK would lose access to the EU's information sharing systems, such as the Rapid Reporting and Response System. So can I ask the noble lady, the Minister, specific about this? So if that is the case, is there any mechanism for the UK to be notified about unsafe products from the EU market? that are already being developed there or are already mirroring products that are already they've already entered the UK market. Is there any other system for that notification to take place, or are we simply reliant on the rapid reporting response system? Given that a lot of these products will be used globally, and so reporting will be taking place and alerts will be taking place right across the globe on any problems that seem to be occurring. And I suppose on the other side of the coin, how will EU member states and the European Commission be notified about unsafe products from the UK markets when they are not just UK specific, but they've also entered the EU market? And how will we intend to do that if we don't have the formalised systems in place? And does the Minister accept, I think the point echoed around the Chamber this afternoon, around the committee this afternoon, that if we don't have access to that EU information sharing system, there is a cause for concern that UK citizens will be less safe and less well protected, and what guarantees can we give that that won't be the case? In addition, the instrument state, quote, biodegradability requirements will be transferred to the Secretary of State as the UK's competent authority for detergents, and these functions will then be exercised by the Health and Safety Executive after exit, unquote. I'd like to probe this issue about biodegradability because it is a matter that people value and people hold dear. I just want to be sure that with the Minister having responsibility, that biodegradability will not be downgraded in the future as a consequence of other trade priorities and other trade negotiations that are taking place. So it's the detergent version of chlorinated chicken, I suppose you might say. We want the trade deal, and if the price of the trade deal is that we lower our standards, what protection can we be assured for UK citizens that that won't be environmentally or at a safety level won't be downgraded? Then in the draft detergents amendment, the specific draft detergent amendment SI, it states, quote, there is an option for the HSE acting as the competent authority for the detergents regulation under an agency agreement with the Secretary of State to charge a fee for processing derogation applications for the use of industrial and institutional I'm going to get this right now, surfactants. So can I ask the Minister on that issue, what is the fee? How will the HSE enforce the fee? Is there any way that that fee will be in any way off-putting to businesses who will potentially otherwise want to trade in this country? And then several noble lords referred to the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee's report and about the issue of resources, because in their report they said HSE's responsibilities after EU exit will expand significantly as a result of these and other instruments. It will need to be resourced adequately to carry out its new functions, unquote. Well, that's very different from what the noble lady has said, the Minister has said this afternoon when she said that the additional requirements were minimal. So I think we need to find some way of bottoming this out. Is she saying that the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee was wrong? They've obviously looked into this matter and they are saying that it will need additional resources. So it would be helpful if the noble lady could clarify what the actual score is here. And what is the additional funding that has been provided to the HSE to carry out these extra functions? And how many extra staff does she envisage being hired to carry out these extra responsibilities? My Lords, this regulation also states that the detergents regulations cross-refer to a number of other pieces of EU legislation, including the REACH regulations. And I know we're not going to debate this today, but I just want to put on record that in case anyone was in any doubt, that we have serious concerns about the instrument relating to REACH regulations, which I know we will deal with separately and we will address it there. But many of the same concerns about REACH are also concerns that we have here about access to important information that the EU would normally have collated and shared with us and which will no longer be available. My Lords, in paragraph 7.5, it states that the Secretary of State, as the competent authority for detergents for the UK, will exercise these powers, taking expert advice as appropriate. So, can I ask what that means about expert advice? Where will this advice come from? Is it just UK advice, or will the Secretary of State consult any other European agencies when formulating a policy on this regard? And this matter, the issue about scientific and technical process also comes up in relation to the technical annexes. So, can I ask, again, who will be providing that scientific and technical progress when the technical, the update of the technical annexes takes place? How often is it envisaged that they will be updated, and who will be consulted about these updates before they're published? Can I then turn to the issue of the safeguarding, the detergent safeguarding regulations? As has been said, the safeguarding clause, the EM says it may only be used on a case-by-case basis for a specific product, not for a class of product. And it goes on to say the safeguarding clause therefore cannot be used to introduce risk management measures of a general nature. So can the Minister confirm that that will indeed be done on a case-by-case basis, and that there won't be any attempt to extend the use of this provision for a more general policy change? What safeguards do we have that it will be curtailed to case-by-case? Also, in paragraph 2.5, it states member states intending to use the safeguard clause must immediately inform the Commission and other member states documenting the reason for their decision. So can I ask, in that situation, will a devolved administration, which intends to initiate the safeguard, have the same obligation to immediately inform all the devolved administrations, the Secretary of State and the HSE, in the same way as member states currently do? So what information sharing will there be within the UK to make sure that we're all aware of any safeguarding issues? And then in paragraph 7.2, it goes on to say the Secretary of State and devolved administrations will be able to take urgent temporary restrictive action in relation to a product through a safeguarding clause. So can I ask, how will this process take place? How will this decision be made? Will there be consultation between administrations? Will the HSE consult devolved administrations? If Scotland decides to take action, does that mean that the decision will apply throughout the UK? So it would be helpful if the noble lady could say more about how that devolved responsibility will operate. And finally, on that issue about safeguarding, if there is a concern, and there's concern about a specific detergent, how will businesses be notified that their product is in some way being queried? If the products are already in the market, is there an arrangement for the products to be recalled? So what are the actual practicalities of detergents being identified as being a risk to health or of humans or animals, and how will that be dealt with the businesses concerned? And then one last question, which is the issue of the safeguarding measures not being imposed for more than 90 days. And perhaps the noble lady could say why it is 90 days. And if that product still poses a risk, can the measure be extended or rolled over, or do we have to revisit it from the start again? So what's the limitations on that 90 days, and why was that time chosen? I look forward to her response.
I'd like to thank all noble lords for their contributions to the debate today. It's been a measured debate, and thankfully fairly on topic, which is always a relief. But a number of noble lords have raised some very good questions, and I hope to be able to answer them. To the extent that I'm not able to, I certainly will write. But I'd like to address one of the issues straight up, and that is about environmental protections post-exit. The government is very, very clear that we will not weaken environmental protections when we leave the EU, but we will instead maintain and even enhance our already high environmental standards. This detergents SI will ensure the continuation of standards and requirements in relation to the placing of on the market of detergents, while at the same time maintaining this high degree of protection for the environment and human health. And I hope that as I go through the answers to the questions today, that we will feel that this is indeed the case. Turning briefly, though, to an issue raised by my noble friend Lady McIntosh about the ACHA and the European Chemicals Agency and other bodies, and whether we will have a relationship with them in the future. And of course, I'm sure noble lords will agree with me that I very much hope that we do. It is a matter of negotiation. Obviously, we would very much appreciate being a member of RAPEX going forward. It would save us possibly having to set up systems ourselves, but of course that is a matter for negotiation, and as noble lords will know, at this moment in time we are dealing with a no-deal SI, and this is in the context of us not reaching an agreement. Turning to the topic of the safeguarding SI specifically, I would certainly like to say up front there is absolutely no complacency from the government's part in terms of what we intend to do in these very rare instances where these safeguarding clauses might be needed. They will only be used on a case-by-case basis because they're extremely rare. There has to be very great justifiable grounds that the detergent constitutes a serious risk to human health and the environment. Because, my lords, these detergents will already have been placed on the market and should therefore and will be in compliance with the detergents regulation. The Secretary of State and the devolved authorities must give reasons for their measures, submitting the scientific or technical information on which they are based before effectively taking action against the product. The safeguard clause is therefore primarily to protect the integrity of the market, in this case the UK market, and also to provide reassurance to businesses that action will only be taken on a case-by-case basis, and as noble lords will have noted from the explanatory memorandum, this is on a product-specific case-by-case basis. It doesn't refer to entire classes of product. It is not a system for longer-term risk management. That is where the technical annexes to the main SI come in, and those are the ones where to amend those technical annexes to improve the environmental protections will require a second statutory instrument to go through your Lordship's House in the usual fashion. The noble lady, Lady Jones, mentioned the devolved administrations, and this is an important matter because this is a devolved matter, and we are working extremely close with the devolved administrations to make sure that the frameworks are in place to encourage working together. The draft regulations provide that the Secretary of State or a devolved authority takes provisional measures that it must immediately inform the other authorities, so that all authorities become aware at the same time and submit the scientific and the technical information to those authorities at that time. The other authorities can, of course, then decide on their own right whether or not to impose the same provisional measure within their devolved competence, and, my lords, as a devolved matter, that is entirely right. So, whilst I cannot guarantee that all the DAs would implement the safeguarding provision at the same time, I'm sure noble lords would agree that it would be probably quite unusual if they did not, but I'm sure that if they did not, there would be very good reasons for doing so. But again, this provision is used only very, very rarely. It's been used twice in the last 15 years. And, my lords, I think that if the regulatory regime is right in the first place, it shouldn't be used again for a very, very long time. Turning to the alert service, and it is true that we will lose full access to the information sharing system, such as the EU's Rapid Alert System for Non-Food Products, which is known as RAPEX, in the event of leaving the EU without a deal. Of course, access will depend on negotiations, and I'm sure all noble lords will agree that it would be beneficial to the UK if we were to be part of those negotiations. However, we have to prepare ourselves for where we may be. However, the UK will still have access to publicly available information on RAPEX, and I'm sure noble lords would agree that if there was a sudden concern about a product, for it not then to be publicly shared on RAPEX, I suggest would be quite unusual. And I think, from the government's perspective, we are setting up a new product safety database, which will be set up by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And this will also underpin the safety of obviously citizens, but also environmental to minimise environmental risks in the future. So producers and distributors will have to inform their local authority, typical the Trading Standards Department, about any unsafe detergent product, as is now, and then the local authority will then take action. The noble Lord Addington asked about this 90-day and whether it can be extended or rolled over. My Lords, this is a provisional measure. It is not used in response to a long-term change in status for a particular product. After the 90-day period ended, a slightly modified version of the General Product Safety Regulations 2005 then applied to that detergent. These regulations require all products to be safe and contain their own enforcement provisions in the form of safety notices requiring withdrawal from the market. So having been through the 90 days, that is the next situation that particular product will find itself in, if indeed it is deemed to be unsafe. Turning to a question from the noble Lady Baroness Jones of Whitchurch about the UK being notified about unsafe products that are already here post-exit, and how will we notify the EU in return? Well, also, I suppose my answer is very similar to what I have already been able to explain, in that although we won't have access to RAPEX, we will know about publicly available information, and of course we would have the BEIS database. We will not, the UK will not be able to notify the EU directly through a formal system about unsafe products. However, this, as I remind noble lords, is for a no-deal situation. It is the worst case scenario, and certainly this may change in the future. Information sharing is always beneficial in these areas, and it's in everyone's interest to share information, and that is across the EU, but also where possible globally.
Sorry to interrupt the Minister. This late stage, but can I just be clear myself whether these detergents are subject to REACH regulations, or do they have to go through the REACH system as well? Because as you probably know, the majority of chemicals, if there's more than 1 tonne that's exported or imported into the UK, then they are covered by REACH regulations, which lay down a very large number of other issues. So I just wonder whether these were included or not. I'm sorry, it's an unfair question to I don't mean it's an absolute immediate response.
No question is an unfair question, my Lord.
But it is a vital question.
It is a very interesting question. And it is the case that these are subject to the REACH regulations. And the noble Baroness Lady Jones of Whitchurch did mention the REACH regulations, and I note her concerns about the REACH regulations. These will be debated, as I'm sure the noble lady is aware, in due course in your Lordship's House, and they have already been debated in the other place on the 25th of February. But what I might do on that particular issue is I do have a little bit more information, but I want to put it into proper context, so I will write to the noble lord on that.
Thank you.
Returning to the issue of biodegradability and whether it would be downgraded in future. And, my lords, this is a very important issue. This is the issue as to whether or not these detergents and these surfactants hang around in the environment for a long time, and that is clearly a very bad thing because they play havoc with water tension and things like that. And the government has set out a vision for a green Brexit, in which environmental standards will not only be maintained, but they'll also be enhanced. The biodegradability criteria in the detergents regulations are essential in avoiding these adverse impacts on the environment. And so we are obviously mindful that if they are not disposed properly, they can cause foaming, they can degrade, they can assist the eutrophication of rivers, which I believe is obviously not beneficial to organic life. Trade agreements can cover a range of issues, and although the UK will be able to negotiate its own trade deals in the event of a no deal, focusing on growth areas for our economy, the UK government continues to be committed to high environmental standards after EU exit and maintaining a high degree of continuity with current climate goals, green policies and wider environmental targets. And I would just like to reassure the Noble Lady that, as I mentioned earlier, any changes to the technical annexes will be done by statutory instrument and therefore will come before your Lordship's House, and that those sorts of issues would be included within that. A number of Noble Lords touched on the resourcing of the HSE, and I had fair wind that I thought that this might come up. It is the case that this was noted by the SLSC, but I suspect that the SLSC probably got to the stage where they had seen the HSE a number of times and thought, hang on a minute, we probably want to do something. Because for these instruments, the additional administrative requirements for the HSE is minimal. However, what I will commit to do for Noble Lords is to try and get an understanding across the piece about the HSE and how many additional functions they are being asked to take on, and just confirm that, that they are satisfied with the resources that they have. Because I think that's only fair, because this one is minimal. I completely understand that, but the SLSC has indeed made that point, and I think it's worth following up on. The issue of fees for the HSE is an interesting one. This is only for derogations, and there has only been one derogation across the EU. So the fees for derogations are agreed. There was a consultation with the industry, and I could go into great detail about what these fees are, but they're designed to meet the costs of derogations. Obviously, we don't expect derogations to happen very often. A derogation is where you're using, where one is using a detergent for a specific purpose, and actually it doesn't fall within the regulations. It would be highly unlikely, really, nowadays, with the sort of biodegradable detergents that we have, that they would be very frequent at all. And then moving on to the issue of experts. The Noble Lords will be aware that the Health and Safety Executive is a world leader in the regulation of chemicals and will continue to be so following EU exit. It also has the necessary regulatory, scientific and technical expertise in-house. However, the Chief Scientific Advisor Guidelines on the Use of Scientific and Engineering Advice and Policy Making, Guidelines 2010, state that advice from external sources should be sought whenever necessary, and of course, my Lords, we would do so. Sources of research and advice may include the Department's own experts and analysts, research and funding councils, expert advisory systems such as the Science Advisory Councils and the Scientific Advisory Committees, research from non-departmental sources. And my Lords, we have a very great tradition of science and research in this country, and I remain convinced that we would find the right expert for the right, or the right group of experts for the right problem. And indeed, these obviously, as Noble Lords will be aware, these experts will be used to update the annexes, which of course, again, go through the usual process. The Noble Lady Baroness Jones touched on governance, and this is a place where we've been a few times before. I'm going to have to not be able to accede to that wish today. I can go no further than we have been able to go before with regards the future of governance and the Office for Environmental Protection, but I commit to the Noble Lady that as soon as we can update her, we will. I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Contrary not content, the contents have it.
Detergent Safeguarding Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2019. Baroness Veer of Norbiton.
My Lords, these instruments can correct technical deficiencies in legislation. Oh!
Do you want to move forward? Because you had two amendments together.
Yes. My apologies. Move formally.
The question is that this amendment be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Contrary not content, the contents have it.
Organic Production and Control Amendment, EU Exit Regulations 2019, Baroness Vera of Northerton.
Finally. My Lords, these instruments correct technical deficiencies in legislation relating to organic production to ensure operability on exit. The instruments introduce no new policy and preserve the current regime's organic standards. The Government is strongly supportive of organic standards, many of which were developed in the UK and adopted by the EU. The UK has a world-recognised standard of food production and labelling, which we wish to see maintained. These instruments are grouped as they both relate to amendments to organic legislation. Early indications from the sifting committees were that SIs laid as negative, but with a connection to agriculture, were being selected to be uplifted to affirmative. While the Organic Production and Control Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2019 was not specifically recommended for uplift by the sifting committee, we chose to voluntarily uplift this SI to reduce the risk of it running out of parliamentary time. The Organic Production Control of Imports Amendment EU Exit Regulations contains transfer of functions provisions, and as such the affirmative procedure must apply. These statutory instruments apply to the United Kingdom, and we have worked with the devolved administrations on their development. The legislation amended by the Organic Production and Control Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2019 relates to devolved matters, and the devolved administrations have consented to that SI. The Organic Production Control of Imports Amendment EU Exit Regulations are reserved. Officials have had very helpful discussions with counterparts in the DAs, and we are working with them in respect of all aspects of the organics regime to form an agreement on how we all work together going forward. The Organic Production and Control Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2019 ensure that organic standards remain the same as now for organic operators within the UK by amending deficiencies within the retained EU law. For example, references to the UK as a member state. The certification and traceability of organic food and feed products will continue. This instrument sets out minor technical amendments and lays down a time-limited period during which the UK would not require additional border checks for organic products imported from the EU, the EEA and Switzerland. Turning to the Organic Production Control of Imports Amendment EU Exit Regulations, this also amends deficiencies in the retained EU legislation, but deals with reserved measures covering imports and trade in organic food, feed and vegetative propagating material or seeds for cultivation. The SI transfers powers from the Commission to the UK to recognise countries and control bodies that can operate for the purposes of export to the UK. The SI also sets out minor technical amendments and lays down a time limit for the recognition of organic products imported from the EU, the EEA and Switzerland. The UK organics industry is currently regulated by EU law, which sets out standards for organic production. Regulations apply to the production of food, animal feed, livestock, including bees and farmed fish, and any food or feed products marketed as organic. They set the requirement for organic production, processing, labelling and imports, as well as the inspection system that must be placed to ensure the requirements are met. They stipulate that organic food must be inspected and certified within the scope of a tightly regulated framework and originate from businesses registered and approved by organic control bodies on the basis of a rigorous annual inspection. The regulations will now apply to imports at UK borders rather than EU borders, and ensure the continued regulation and certification of organic products to the current standards applicable within the UK, and equivalent standards where these have been agreed with third countries. In addition, to ensure we can maintain the status quo and allow UK organic importers to continue to access their goods and ingredients from Europe as now, we have added provisions which permit, for a time-limited period until the 31st of December 2020, the UK also recognises the EU, the EEA states and Switzerland as having an equivalent organic regulatory regime to the UK. During this period, the UK will also exempt the need for additional checks or paperwork for organic goods originating from these areas. This exemption does not apply to goods that are simply transiting through these territories. This will ensure the status quo remains immediately after exit. These measures remain essential to ensure UK organic businesses can maintain their organic certification and thrive in this growing sector. These instruments will ensure operability that the strict standards that are in place for organic production are maintained when we leave the EU. Officials have engaged regularly with the United Kingdom Organic Certifiers Group. Our decision to continue to recognise the EU, EEA and Switzerland for a time-limited period has been welcomed by the group as providing certainty on imports for the immediate future. We continue to work closely with them on this and the future implementation of the EU-UK regulations. My Lords, I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
Lords, I thank my noble friend the Minister for introducing these two amendments, and I'm particularly pleased that there will be a smooth transfer into UK law. The organic sector is still considered a fairly small one, but a very, very important one, and it in fact brings in a good, healthy amount of money within the UK sector itself, 2.2 billion to the UK economy, and exports worth some 200 million to the UK economy as well. So the continuation of this trade is hugely important. At this stage, I should declare that our own family farming interests, but we are not organic. We produce very healthy, good food, but it's not purely organic. In the memorandum, it talks about having taken the views of that there are some 6,000 operators, and many of those are small businesses themselves. I wonder, and classified as small is up to 50 people. In an organic movement, that's actually quite a lot of people. And I did wonder how many of the smaller ones, say 10 or even 5 less, would form a proportion of this amount. Because the query that went through my mind was, although it's not supposed to have any financial burdens to them, if you are a smaller business, it obviously does have greater implications for you in the actual organisation of what you have to do. So on that one, I would be grateful. But I'm glad about on the control of imports that it is clearly laid out. I did slightly smile when we had a list of 20 pages of individual categories, which actually shows how complex and varied the whole organic sector is. If I turn to the production and control amendment, I welcome this because it, I hope, will give great certainty to those who are organic producers. They, in turning to become organic from having been perhaps commercial farmers, it takes them for up to 3 years to do it. We've often said that farming is a long-term investment, which clearly it is. But on the organic side, it's specifically actually more demanding because there are certain things you can do during your term of transfer and certain things you can't do. So,
interrupt the noble lady, but we have a division in the House. The committee will adjourn for 10 minutes.
My Lords, returning to the discussions we are having on these two amendments, I think I've about covered everything that I wish to. I had stressed the importance of the organic movement in the way in which we are now up to some 6,000 organic operators, and that it's worth a lot of money both to farming and agriculture in this UK economy, and even more importantly, on the growth of our exports as well. I'm grateful for the smooth transition that has been planned by the government, and apart from the one question that I had on the definition of small and the very much smaller businesses, I well realise that the memorandum indicates that there is no expected cost to them, but I would be grateful for the Minister for a little clarification on that when she comes to respond.
My Lords, we warmly welcome these SIs, which are absolutely essential for the continuity of trade in organic products, and we particularly welcome the fact that the government recognises with the voluntary uplift, which indeed is very welcome. I probably should declare, because it makes me a little bit more passionate about the sector, that I used to work for the Soil Association, albeit very many years ago now. And in fact, that was at a time when they were developing the certification techniques with the EU. So it was an interesting time to be there. And really, the sector's moved on a lot in those intervening some 25 years. The sector, by and large, as we are very happy with these SIs. I don't think they had any concerns about them as they currently are. They're happy that they're being proposed and debated as a framework for certainty for organic producers and consumers. As Noble Lady Byford said, it's a really vibrant market. Some 2.3 billion is the organics market in the UK, of which 8% goes abroad, mainly to EU countries. And the importance of the organic sector, I think, for the UK is that it's actually introduced consumers very largely to many of the ideas about more sustainable agriculture. So apart from being worthy in economic terms and an employer, it's also been really a flagship in terms of introducing ideas around sustainability, importance of soil, the issues around chemical inputs and so on. So it's really a sector that deserves our absolutely full attention. So the government has taken the necessary step to ensure the continuity of trade through this SI. And if there's any concerns, it's really with the fact that this is a period of certainty for 21 months. And as it mentions at the end of Annex 2, at the end of that period, things will become uncertain again. And 21 months in terms of farming is as nothing, really. I mean, if you're trying to make investments, if you're trying to change your farming methods, if you're in conversion, 21 months is an extremely short time. So both producers and UK certification bodies would really like as soon as possible to move into a period of greater certainty, and I hope that the department will be working on that. So the question of how the regulation will be administered, controlled and particularly developed in the light of future changes and challenges is something I hope the Minister can touch on her reply. Because undoubtedly there'll be challenges from developments within other organic regulations. It's a fairly fast-moving scene now with different products being withdrawn or coming onto the market. And of course, if we're starting to enter trade agreements, I would say heaven forbid, but it's possible with the US, that's going to be a massive challenge. So it's a fast-moving scene, and I hope that the Minister can give us some certainty about how this is going to be developed. Of course, for consumers, it's also equally important that the certification is absolutely gold-plated, because organic products command a premium price. So it's essential that consumers, when they're paying that premium price, can absolutely rely on the origin, production methods, processing methods of that produce. Because otherwise, that would if there's doubt enters that market, that would very adversely affect all of those who are engaged in genuine organic production. I feel this afternoon it would be difficult, and I heard the Minister's caveat, so I'll only mention this very briefly, but not to mention the issues of tariffs. Because, of course, that is going to be another massive pressure on producers. And I gather tariffs are about to be published, or they may have been published during this afternoon. But that is another huge pressure on producers that I hope we'll have the chance to debate in your Lordship's House in the very near future.
My Lords, I'm grateful to the Noble Lady, the Minister, for the introduction to these SIs this afternoon and for organising the helpful briefing beforehand. And, My Lords, we accept that these SIs are necessary to maintain current standards regulating the UK's growing organic sector. The continued availability of high-quality produce and sustainable food supplies, in which the organic sector plays a key role, is vital for our food industry and important for consumers. And, for example, the Soil Association report that the UK organic sector grew by 5.8% in 2018, its eighth consecutive year of growth. And as the EM makes clear, the industry is worth something like £2.2 billion to the UK economy. And I very much take the point of the Noble Lady Baroness Byford, who quite rightly made the point that so many working in that sector are small businesses and make a particular contribution to the economy in that regard. And obviously it's important that their futures are protected. The Noble Lady Baroness Miller said that she felt that the sector didn't have any concerns about these SIs, and I'll come back to that. But the Minister will be aware that the industry are already reporting negative impacts caused by the ongoing uncertainty of Brexit. Confidence is being undermined, and businesses are warning that the consecutive years of growth achieved by the UK organic sector could be at risk. So we're looking at this batch of organic SIs this afternoon, but also what the Minister is able to say to reassure the market of the continued access which the sector deserves and requires going forward. So, my Lords, with this in mind, I do have some questions to the Minister. And the first is on the issue of imports. And this is an issue that Baroness Miller raised, which is about the 21-month deadline. The Annex 2 of the memorandum says, quote, "For a strictly time-limited period of 21 months, we will exempt the need for additional checks or paperwork for organic goods being imported directly from the EU, the EEA states or Switzerland, except those organic goods which do not originate from but are simply transiting through these territories," unquote. So I'd like to explore what that 21-month deadline means. Can the Minister give some clarity on that? Has that amount of time been chosen to line up with the transition period? If that is the case, what would happen if the transition period is extended? And is that 21-month an absolute deadline, whether it's a deal, no deal? Is that written in blood, so to speak? So perhaps you could clarify the status of that 21-month deadline so that we're all clear on that. Secondly, on the issue of exports, of course we know, and it's been touched on, that future export arrangements with the EU are a matter for future negotiations. But can the Minister give us an assurance that future access to the EU market for our very strong UK organic exporters is indeed a priority for the government? And can she explain why we're giving guarantees to organic imports, but we're not, whilst we don't have in place such guarantees for UK organic exports? So there is an imbalance there, and perhaps the Noble Lady could explain why that is the case. Then could I touch then on the issue of traces? The government have given notice that after the 29th of March, importers will no longer use the EU's trade control and export system, new technology, traces, to register consignments of organic produce, but must use a manual UK organic import system while a digital system is being developed. Can the Minister give the House an update on the progress in building the UK's own digital system? Will it be fully functional on exit day? What work is being done to ensure that the UK industry and its international partners are aware and prepared for this change? What assurances can the Minister give that both the temporary manual system and eventually our own permanent IT system will provide the same level of certainty over origin and movement of produce as we have at the moment? Paragraph 12.3 of the explanatory memorandum on control of imports explains that there hasn't been an impact assessment, but there may be, quotes, minimal familiarisation needed for businesses to set up to use the import and export systems, unquote. So can I ask the government, the Minister, what is a minimal? What minimal means in this instance? Is she assured that this rather minimal objective has been achieved? And is that going to give businesses the information, the knowledge that they need in order to be able to operate under these new systems? In other words, is she assured that the communication system and whatever training systems are absolutely in place and running fully and meeting their objectives? Turning to the ongoing issue of resources and expertise, Annex 2 of the explanatory memorandum on control of imports states that, quote, the UK will be able to accept applications from overseas bodies to certify to the UK organic standards and subsequently approve these bodies if the UK wishes, unquote. So currently DEFRA has approved 8 certification bodies, 6 in the UK and 2 in Ireland. Can I ask whether there is any additional expertise or resources needed in order for the UK to consider and process other applications when we're basically on our own in this matter, rather than having the EU's information scrutiny process to rely on as well? So are those 8 certification bodies up to the job? Are they resourced properly? Do we need other certification bodies? What's the thoughts on that? Then a small point, if you like, but Annex 2 in both orders explains that certain duties in Article 29 and 38 of the Council regulations have been downgraded from shall to may. The notes explain that these duties have already been completed by the EU. Could the Minister provide more information on what these articles include and why the specific duties have been downgraded and what the thinking is behind that? And if they have been fully completed by the EU, then maybe they shouldn't be needed at all, rather than simply referring to may. On the issue of consultation, the paragraph 10.2 in both of the EMs, and I have to say I think both of the EMs were absolutely word for word, so someone's done a great pasting job there, cut and paste, but anyway, I may be wrong, maybe they weren't, but they look like they were word for word. But paragraph 10.2 states that the Department has worked with the United Kingdom Organic Certifiers Group on this legislation. But it doesn't say whether they were in agreement with the proposals. Noble Lady Baroness Miller said she thought they were, but I would just like clarification on this. So can I ask, were any concerns raised by the group concerning these SIs? And if so, have they now been adequately addressed? And then finally, my lords, can I turn to the issue of no deal and the urgent consequences which would arise in the event of a no deal exit? Because the Minister will be aware of the serious concerns raised by the industry on this issue. There is an NFU press release issued in the last couple of days. The Soil Association recently published an open letter to the Secretary of State for DEFRA in which it raised concerns that the BrExit impasse has put growth at risk, caused uncertainty for suppliers and supply chains, and, quote, risks harming the long-term prospects for more sustainable agriculture in the UK, unquote. If the UK does not achieve equivalence, i.e. mutual recognition of each other's organic standards, with the EU in a no-deal scenario, the EU market will be closed to the UK organic certified produce from the 29th of March. So can I ask, what progress has the government made in agreeing equivalence with the EU in the case of no deal? If the UK becomes a third country, UK organic control bodies will need to apply to the European Commission for recognition, and these applications can take up to 9 months. And control bodies are not able to make an application until the UK becomes a third country. DEFRA have said that they are negotiating the possibility of an expedited application process in the event of a no deal. But I think it would be very helpful if the Minister could give the House an update on these negotiations, because a lot of jobs rely on the outcome of them. And in the event of no deal, the labelling of organic produce becomes something of a minefield, as the government themselves have acknowledged in a technical note which they published last month. So can I ask, what kind of grace period will companies be guaranteed to use existing stock before they make the necessary changes? And have the government done an impact assessment on the cost to industry of the uncertainty over whether they have to overhaul their entire packaging and labelling provision in the event of no deal? I know these are broader issues, but I also know that the Minister will understand the real anxiety that this prospect is causing to the organic sector, and I hope that she'll be able to put on record some words of reassurance that these issues are being urgently addressed so that our UK organic, very, very strong UK organic business sector can be protected. I look forward to her response.
I'd like to thank all Noble Lords for their contributions today and for giving up the time to meet with me beforehand to share some of the thoughts that they had about these SIs. And certainly I'd like to start by recognising the strength of feeling across the committee today about the strength of the organic sector in the UK. Certainly this was touched upon by the Noble Lady Baroness Byford. She noted that the total sector is worth 2.2 billion. Our figures say it's worth 2.3 billion, but what's 100 million between friends? It is incredibly important. It is a period, it is an area of growth, and of course we must make sure that that it continues to be one of our key and strong sectors in the future. And the noble lady, my noble friend, Lady Byford, talked about the fact that these are, many of them are smaller operators, and they often have sort of 5 to 10 members of staff, and sometimes if that. And they are very, very important part of the UK organic regime. The control bodies certifying organic operators are on the ground. They are in touch with these businesses, and whilst they can't coach these businesses, they can provide them with information, and that is precisely what they do. And I'd like to reassure Noble Lords that there are no expected costs relating to this SI for such producers. I will come on to the minimal implementation, familiarisation slightly later, but it really is very small, and familiarisation is only for those involved in import and export. But for the majority not involved in those areas, this SI will have no impact at all. But it is important to note that we envisage that support will be there for organic farmers as we look at our financial support for farmers going forward. And I look forward to working with my noble friend Lord Gardiner on the agriculture bill when it finally gets to your Lordship's house. And I'm fairly sure that we're going to have some fairly good debates on that one. But it's not with us just yet. So back to DEFRA, no deal, SIs. Turning to a question raised by the noble Lady Baroness Jones of Whitchurch about the 21 months. And I agree with her. I did look at it and think, 21 months, why on earth would you choose that particular date? And it is for a good reason. And it is that the current EU organic regulation is due to be replaced from the 1st of January 2021. And so it was thought appropriate to limit the recognition of these products to the 30th of December 2020, as those dates are commensurate. Obviously, that date also does happen to be the end of implementation period, but this is a no-deal SI, and there would be no implementation period. So what will happen? Obviously, I cannot give clarity thereafter. That will be up to any number of factors. But certainly, we already have a very good idea of what those new regulations are when they come in 2021. So over the period that we are using this 21-month, the government will look at those regulations and obviously aim to give as much clarity to the sector as soon as we can. Because we recognise that farming cycles are much longer than many other industry sectors. And in terms of regulations being developed in light of the future changes, I mean, certainly the UK has always been a leader in this sector, and it is our intention that we would continue to be so. So we have an opportunity to be at the forefront of developments. If we if we do not have a deal with the European Union, we can work as an independent sovereign state in this matter and work with other people in making sure that we pull other people with us as we increase our organic standards. And of course, we will work very closely with the sector, because without them, there is no organic sector at all, to ensure that the future changes work for the UK and work for the consumers who will be buying these products. The Noble Lady, Lady Jones, and the Noble Lady, Lady Miller mentioned tariffs. The Noble Lady, Lady Miller, is quite right. There was an announcement at 7 o'clock this morning on the tariffs, and I listened to it as I was driving in the car. I have not had the opportunity to go into it in great detail. I suggest she has a look at what was announced today. It obviously was tariffs for across all sorts of different industrial sectors. But organic products are subject to the same tariffs regime as conventional non-organic products. I mean, there has been a bit of movement on tariffs, and certainly the government has tried to reach a balance between making sure that consumers are protected, making sure that businesses are protected, and obviously reducing tariffs as much as we can within that particular framework. But, my Lords, I think it is very important to remember that this is a temporary tariff, and that the tariffs that were announced today will only apply for a period of 12 months. And during this period, we will undertake a full review such that we can adjust the tariffs going forward. If there is a no deal, we will be talking about tariffs, I think, for a very, very long time, which will be fun. So that covers the issue of tariffs. I now need to turn to the issue of uncertainty, because the Noble Lady Baroness Jones is absolutely right. We have managed to, within the powers that we have, to create as much certainty for imports as we possibly can, by providing this 21-month period, during which time the system will stay as it is. Obviously, for exports, it is not within our gift to tell the European Union exactly what to do for our exports. However, it is the case that for UK products to be exported to the EU, it is the case that organic control bodies will need to be authorised by the EU. And this process, certainly, there is no definite length of time that it would take for this to happen. The government is already in technical conversations with the EU about making sure that this happens as quickly as possible. So we are working hard with that. If there is a no-deal situation, obviously this will come to the fore. We recognise the concerns of the NFU and of the Soil Association. I will investigate further and find out and see if I can find out more about the expedited process. This is not anything about which I have information, but we do recognise these concerns. This is a consequence of BrExit. It is not a consequence of the SI that we have before us today, and I'm sure that all Noble Lords would agree that it would, particularly in this particular case, it would be very good if we could get a deal to make sure that our exports continue in the smooth fashion that they would expect. However, it is the case that the EU has equivalency arrangements with a number of non-EU countries, and the UK is aiming to transition those over to mirror the current arrangements. Because our organic standards will be as high as the EU's, we believe that it will be possible to transition those across to improve the flow of exports to those particular nations. Turning to the topic of traces. And could I first of all point out that it is Traces NT, not Traces. Traces NT is Traces New Technology, which is for controlling the import of organic food and feed. Traces is for controlling the imports and exports of live animals. So they are two different systems, just for the record. But work has, so in terms of assurances on the manual and subsequent digital import system, which replaces Traces NT, work has been carried out on to establish the needs of all users for an electronic replacement for Traces NT. The interim manual system largely mirrors the system that was in place just 17 months ago, so it's just a year and a half ago. So users who could use that manual system will be familiar with how this works, and we have carried out a trial to make sure that users are still able to use it, and we have refined the guidance for all users. We will be communicating with and issuing further guidance for the sector, including third parties that are involved in using this system. Organic products en route from third countries or in transit to the UK before the UK leaves the EU will be accepted with an EU certificate of inspection. Products that leave a third country after the UK has left the EU will be required to have a UK certificate of inspection rather than an EU one. Instructions on the introduction and use of the UK certificate of inspection will be issued shortly. Which brings me to the point of minimal familiarisation, which the noble lady mentioned, and it is the fact that this process is already should be within recent institutional memory for many of these organisations that will be needing to use it. Turning to an issue raised by the noble lady Baroness Miller, and I think the noble lady Baroness Jones, if you'll forgive me, perhaps I got that the wrong way round, about the UK taking power to accept applications from third country control bodies and to permit them to operate in the UK, and who will oversee these control bodies. Currently, the Commission has the power to recognise third countries as equivalent to the EU and to recognise control bodies as being able to operate in third countries for the purposes of the import of organic products to the EU. And this, of course, will be transferred to the Secretary of State. So officials are in the process of considering how they will process and consider any such application. But before the UK accepts any application from third countries or control bodies, rigorous checks will be carried out to ensure that the current high organic standards in the UK will be maintained. Concerning the additional resource challenges, the UK is taking back control of organic regulations, and the power is currently held by the EU. UK organic control bodies should continue doing what they do to a world-class level. The government is working closely with the organic control bodies to ensure that any additional burden that falls on the organic sector is properly managed, to ensure that there is no fall in standards or public confidence as a result. Turning to some of the final questions, the issue of shall to may. What are the consequences of downgrading the references from shall to may? When the EU regulation EC 834/2007 was originally drafted, a number of references referred to the Commission needing to create specific rules. These rules were subsequently laid down in implementing regulations 889/2008 and 1235/2008. Therefore, there is no longer a need for the UKSI to require rules to be made in respect of these matters, because they've already been made. However, these instruments retain the power for further detailed rules to be made if necessary. My Lords, I might write on that one, because I do have an example here, but I think it would be more helpful if I put that in a letter so that all noble lords can understand the difference between shall and may in that particular circumstance. Yes, I would just like to reiterate, assure the noble lady, Lady Jones, about the consultation. Concerns were raised about many issues, but it is the case that it was the views of the group that there were not significant concerns about this SI. Their biggest concern, obviously, is to maintain frictionless trade with the EU, and we will be doing everything we can to address that. And finally, there was a question about the grace period. Labelling in particular isn't covered in this SI today, so I don't have anything further on that. However, I can assure the noble lady that organic products that are already on the market in the EU before the 30th of March will be able to be sold and go through the system, but any exported after the 29th of March will not be able to be sold as organic until, of course, we've got other arrangements in place. My Lords, I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Consent. Contrary, not content. The contents have it.
Organic Production, Control of Imports, Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2019, Baroness Vera of Norbiton.
I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Consent. Contrary, not content. The contents have it.
Rural Development Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2019. Lord Gardner of Kimble.
My Lords, I think it's appropriate I should first declare my farming interests set out in the register. My Lords, the matters in the four instruments are closely interrelated, and I hope it would be helpful to your Lordships if I speak to all four together. These instruments amend retained EU law and domestic legislation to ensure that rural development payments and maritime and fisheries payments can still be made after exit day. These amendments will maintain the effectiveness and continuity of EU and domestic legislation that would otherwise be deficient following our exit. These changes are necessary to enable rural development programmes partially funded by the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development, and the Maritime and Fisheries Operational Programme, partially funded by the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, to continue operating effectively in the United Kingdom following exit until their closure at the end of the 2014 to 2020 programming period. There will be an opportunity to consider scheme-specific regulations for the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund at a later date, as these are made operable in the EU exit regulations for the common fisheries policy. My Lords, there are currently 4 rural development programmes operating in the UK, one in each administration, providing funding for rural businesses, farmers, land managers and applicants living in a rural community with the intention of growing the rural economy, increasing productivity and improving the environment. The Maritime and Fisheries Programme is UK-wide and promotes growth in the sector by providing funding for sustainable fisheries, marketing and processing and sustainable aquaculture, amongst other matters. There are 2 European funds that are relevant to these instruments: the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development and the European Maritime Fisheries Fund. The former fund supports the delivery of rural development in the UK and is worth some £430 million per year over the programming period. The latter fund promotes a competitive, environmentally sustainable, economically viable and socially responsible fisheries and aquaculture sector. It is worth some £32 million per year. My Lords, the UK Government has guaranteed that any projects funded from the 2014-2020 allocations from these funds will be funded for their full lifetime. The changes made by these instruments are necessary to ensure that the government guarantee can be honoured and payments can continue to be made to agreement holders using domestic funding in place of funding from the EU. They provide certainty to individuals and businesses who currently receive rural development and maritime fisheries funding, or who are considering applying for funding during the current 2014-2020 programming period. My Lords, the Rural Development Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2019 amend the EU regulation that provides the general rules and structures governing support for rural development, providing payments to be made to agreement holders and laying down rules on programming, networking, management, monitoring and evaluation. The Rural Development Rules and Decisions Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2019 amend the implementing and delegated provisions made under the main Rural Development EU regulation and 4 implementing decisions approving the rural development programmes for each of the devolved authorities. The European Structural and Investment Funds Common Provisions Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2019 amend the EU regulation that sets out the shared framework for all of the European structural and investment funds, but only as far as applying to rural development and maritime and fisheries. Finally, the European Structural and Investment Funds Common Provisions Rules etc. Amendment etc. EU Exit Regulations 2019 amend the supplementary provisions for European Structural and Investment Funds for rural development and maritime and fisheries that are not dealt with elsewhere. My Lords, I would like to emphasise that all of these instruments remedy the deficiencies in the regulations to ensure that they continue to operate effectively when we leave. They do not introduce new policy, are technical in nature, and preserve the current regime for supporting rural businesses, environmental land management, and sustainable fisheries, amongst other matters. The amendments include omitting deficient references to the European Commission and Member States and replace them with either the UK or the relevant authority as appropriate. The instruments also amend references to union law throughout so that the relevant EU regulations continue to operate effectively as part of national law. Provisions which are deficient because they are time-limited, under which the relevant actions have occurred, have also been omitted, such as provisions relating to ex-ante evaluations that have already been completed, and provisions relating to pre-financing, which was paid out when the programmes were initially set up. In addition, my Lords, references to European institutions such as the European Investment Bank are also omitted. One purpose of these modifications is to ensure continuity and clarity as to which public bodies have responsibilities towards the programmes. The obligations and discretions placed on Member States will continue to be exercised after exit by relevant authorities in the UK. In this context, relevant authority means the current managing authority of the Maritime and Fisheries Operational Programme, the Marine Management Organisation, the Secretary of State in relation to the Rural Development Programme for England, Scottish Ministers in relation to the Rural Development Programme for Scotland, Welsh Ministers in relation to the Rural Development Programme for Wales, and the Department for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs in relation to the Rural Development Programme for Northern Ireland. As noble Lords are well aware, agriculture and fisheries are devolved policy areas and are of special importance to all parts of the kingdom. We have worked closely with the devolved administrations to produce these instruments, and they place great importance on them. They have given them their full support. I repeat now, these statutory instruments are required for the continued operation of the rural development programmes and the maritime and fisheries programme. Without these statutory instruments, there would be no legal powers to make payments to fulfil the promises that these important programmes will continue. My Lords, I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
Honourable friend for bringing forward this little group of statutory instruments, and I'd like to pursue what was raised in the subcommittee B's report, the 18th report of the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee. It gives the Chamber, the committee this afternoon, the opportunity to probe, as we've been invited to do by the subcommittee, for more financial information. And I have a series of questions, if I may, and I'll try not to repeat myself. There will be schemes that have finished. There will be new schemes that will commence, but will end after a key date. It could be 2021, 2022. What advice is my noble friend and his department giving to those who may be in a position to enter a new scheme but are reluctant to do so as they're not sure whether it will complete and what the funding will be for those schemes? My understanding is that there are schemes that fall into that category, and there is a concern that has been raised. In paragraph 7.5 of, obviously it's not numbered, but the 2019 Exiting the European Union Agriculture, Rural Development Rules and Decisions Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2019. I have a question. It says, on EU exit, the UK will seek reimbursement from the EU for all CAP payments made to beneficiaries up to the 29th of March 2019. On what basis are we seeking, because we're still members of the European Union, so I'd just like to know what the legal basis is for that, because it seems very odd that we're committed 2014, 2019 under the EU schemes. Is it for that period? It says up to, so I just asked for clarification because I don't understand what the legal basis for that is. It goes on to say that thereafter such funding will be provided by Her Majesty's Treasury, and I know this is of great interest to the farming press and to the farming community generally. What is the budget from which those funds will be provided going forward? It then goes on to say that the UK government has guaranteed that any EAFRD projects where funding has been agreed before the end of 2020 will be funded for their full lifetime. Again, I think it would be helpful to know where these funds are coming from. It goes on to say that the guarantee also means that DEFRA and the devolved administrations can continue to sign new projects this year and during 2020. What will be the life of those schemes? What will be their duration? And again, where will the money come from? It goes on to say then that in addition, the government has pledged to continue to commit the same total in funds for farm support until the end of this Parliament, expected in 2022. This has been exercising me for some time because the government has consistently said that we are committed to paying monies until the end of this Parliament, expected in 2022. It begs the question that if a general election, heaven forfend, was held before 2022, possibly this year, does that leave the door open to a newly elected government to cease to pay those funds for those 3 years, from 2019 to 2022, particularly if there was, heaven forfend, a change of government? It's just not clear, and it gives us the opportunity to clarify that this afternoon. I'd also like to ask, going forward, I think the government has said there's going to be a transitional phase of continuing to support the farmers with these schemes that are the subject of this SI today from 2022 until 2027. Is that going to be the subject of a different statutory instrument, or does it rightly fall within this instrument? And again, does my noble friend, the Minister, have any idea as to what the funds will be? I think it would be helpful to know. I know the farmers tend to plan a year or longer ahead, but I think it would be helpful to know, does the department envisage the similar type of schemes to those that have qualified? My concern is that if you take the active farmer out, and if you change the countryside stewardship schemes to natural capital schemes that we as yet, the tariffs have been published, but we don't yet know what these environmental benefit schemes. Now, I know this is largely an argument that we will have, a discussion, not an argument, a debate that we will have when it comes to the agriculture bill. But if you are only going to reward the people, and I was very wedded to this idea of rewarding public good, all the farmers and land owners that perform environmental schemes for the public good. But if you don't own the land, you won't get the money. And my noble friend will hear an awful lot about this, but there are graziers and there are tenant farmers at the moment who are receiving small amounts of money, but which are keeping them in farming and enabling them to tend the hillsides, for which it will be very difficult to envisage that short of sheep and cattle grazing, how else we're going to see that those hills will be planned going forward. So I think I've covered all these points. Most of them were raised also in paragraph 3 of page 3 of the subcommittee report, but I think I've covered all the ground that I wish to. But obviously, it does beg a number of questions that I've set out that I hope my noble friend will take the opportunity to allay a number of fears.
My Lords, I rise to follow my noble friend with her various questions, because she had touched on some of the things that I wish to raise. I think the whole question of timescale is hugely important, because some of the agricultural schemes particularly have in the past run for 10 years, some of the 7 years. So the timescale that she has just said, between 20 and 27, is only a span of 5 years. So I think there is an ongoing question there that needs to be resolved. The whole question of active farmer and who receives payments in the future is something that we've talked about in many of our discussions on agriculture. And particularly I wondered whether that would actually in the future could include youth projects and retirement projects as well, or whether that is actually outside these particular amendments that we're looking at the moment. It may well be that it is, and if I'm told that, then I'm perhaps even happier than I am with it not being mentioned here. My noble friend spoke about tenant farmers and graziers, commoners, but if I might also raise the whole question of contractors with the Minister, because so many farms, as indeed ours are now contracted out. It's easier in the past to have always referred to tenant farmers, but I think one will find there are many, many more contracted arrangements now between farmers. I too would like to again pick up from the Scrutiny Committee's Subcommittee B on their reports in paragraph 3 and 4. And again, it refers to the deficiencies, but I think the Minister in his presentation this afternoon has covered many of that. If there's anything he wants to add to it, that, you know, it would be good for the committee to hear. But the second thing really was the whole question of the financial analysis that's taken place and what's happening on that. If I turn then back to the European Structural Investment Funds one particularly, and refer to page 3 in the memorandum, where they talk about this special interest of the joint committee. And I understand that the House of Lords Sifting Committee didn't think it was necessary to have a debate. But in fact, the House of Commons recommended that we should, and that's why we're here today, having this debate on it. It would be interesting to know what particularly they were unhappy about and what steps the government have taken to rectify that. But overall, obviously, these are welcome. They are very technical. They allow systems to keep going as they are. If I could move to the rural payments one, where we talked about, I'm going to lose my papers here, this is not good, where we talked about money being made available for rural development. Can I ask the Minister, will that also define, for example, the making possible for groups of people to come together to enhance businesses, to make that food chain shorter? Because it's not clear in this, it isn't defined as such in that. Because one of the big challenges that I think we face as a nation is to how we can contain the costs of producing food. And as the Minister himself, because he's so well knowledgeable on these things, knows very well the great advantage that one has, particularly in fruit growing or whatever it might be, that it's actually a chain that links it all together. And money has been put aside in the past for that sort of work. And I wonder whether that would fall within these particular amendments which we're considering today. It isn't defined, and I think it would be of great help, because I wonder whether there will be greater freedom when we accept these and then move on to be able to develop more ideas of our own as to how, or the UK could develop more ideas of its own, as to how money could be better used to help ensuring that we can produce food to the very high standards that we do, and enable that chain to be reduced so that the actual cost to the consumer can be contained in a better way than perhaps it has been in the past. It's been a bit fractioned in some of the areas. Pigs and poultry are not falling into that, but there are some other areas, particularly in horticulture as well, where I think the coming together of business would actually bring great benefits. And I'm not quite clear from having read through this whether, in fact, that falls within the category of the thinking behind these amendments.
My Lords, I'm speaking to the first two of these four statutory instruments that are being taken together. I thank the Minister and his officials for their very helpful briefing session on what is a very complex subject, as Lady Byford has already indicated. The European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development provides for rural development programmes which run under the multi-annual financial framework. And this SI allows funded programmes to run allegedly unhindered after exit date until their natural end in 2020. Annex 2 of the explanatory memorandum lists the 6 legacy regulations affected by the SI, 2 more in which deficiencies will be remedied, and 4 where the devolved administrations have had programme amendments approved. This will ensure that structure fund programmes should continue to run smoothly. As I understand it, these programmes will continue to report in the same way as previously, but will report to the rural development programmes of England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland as the relevant devolved administrations, instead of direct to the EU. The aim of this SI is to ensure operability of schemes and the continuity of investment in rural areas, and that is the key element for me. That's really important. My Lords, I should like to ask about the specifics of reporting mechanisms. The EU was very stringent on the information that was required by those who receive structure funds. As being involved with an organisation that had some of their money, I am aware of just how stringent it was. Can the Noble Lord the Minister reassure us that the UK will be getting good value for public money? This is especially necessary now that the Exchequer will be picking up the funding instead of the EU. As someone who comes from a rural community, I have a keen interest in the effect of these SIs. Last Friday, I took part in a rural conference whose chief aim was to press the government to produce a rural strategy. The government have produced an industrial strategy which addresses the needs of urban communities and their economy. Now it is time to produce a strategy to address some of the huge disadvantages that rural communities face. These range from lack of infrastructure, lack of transport, significantly less pupil funding, lack of affordable housing and poor access to services. I am concerned that the lifeline of rural development funding will be cut off by 2021 to be replaced by a nebulous undertaking that this will in future be covered by the Agriculture Bill. The Agriculture Bill, as published, made some significant changes in the way funding for farming and the environment would take place, as has already been said, public money for public good. But this bill has become stuck in the Commons after committee stage. My Lords, I'm concerned that a large gap in funding for rural areas is opening up before us. The Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee B estimates that the value of EU funds, as the Noble Lord has indicated, it's going to need to be replaced, is between £400 and £450 million a year of the European Agriculture Fund for Rural Development programmes. And that is for the remainder of the period to 2020. The loss of this investment will be keenly felt by many in very deep rural areas. Paragraph 7.3 of the explanatory memorandum states that after EU exit, no new rural developments will need to be approved, and that from 2021, new agriculture and environment schemes will be delivered under the Agriculture Bill. Therefore, the Agricultural Bill will need to be in place by 2021. It should have been in place by the 29th of this month, so that rural development communities could plan ahead and have confidence that they were not going to suffer from a severe lack of resources. My Lords, I know that the Noble Lord the Minister understands these issues, but I'm not sure that the rest of the government does. 12.1 of the explanatory memorandum under the impact states beneficiaries will continue to receive rural development funding as before EU exit. My Lords, I am not confident that this will happen, and I am very concerned about the fate of rural communities.
My Lords, first of all, I'd like to thank and then apologise to the Minister for having missed his briefing on Monday. I was election monitoring in West Africa, and I left central Guinea-Bissau at the right time. The journey all the way back to Gatwick Airport was perfect until I tried to get the Gatwick Express to Victoria Station, and it all went wrong, and I missed the meeting. So I apologise to him for that. I've had the privilege of being a board member of the Marine Management Organisation for 6 years, and it was a great privilege, a DEFRA non-departmental public body. And actually, EMFF, I have an awful lot to do with the structural funding over the years, both as an MEP and in other roles locally in the southwest, and a little bit as part of the MMO. And I just want to say that the EMF recently has been one of the best delivered structural funds that there have been, and I want to particularly thank for the good work of the Finance Director, Michelle Willis, and under the direction of John Tuckett, the Chief Executive, who managed to deliver a programme of structural funding pretty well on time and the right quality, which is unusual in this area. But I know the Minister always likes me to be positive, so can I really seriously congratulate the Government in one area in particular, but there will be other areas as well, and it is in 6.7 of the explanatory memorandum. For the first time ever, the Government has used the term fishers rather than fishermen. I've brought this up before, and the Government response was, why they used the word fishermen, is that we consulted with the industry, and that's what they said they wanted to be used, fishermen. You think, well, I think there's something wrong in the way that sort of logic works, but I don't want to, but congratulations on that. In fact, my subcommittee's report most recently on the landing obligation, which I won't go into today, also used that terminology, because that is the way that in most other English-speaking countries participants in this industry are actually described. So I hope that will continue into very much into the future. I welcome the fact that funding is going to continue, but I don't know. Here we are, discrimination again. In 7.6, let me quote it on the explanatory memorandum. The same cash in total funds for farm support until the end of this Parliament expected in 2022. 2022. And farm support, where's the fishing industry? Only up to 2020. I don't think there's any commitment to fisheries for those final 2 years. And once again, I see a discrimination against, to be frank, an industry that's on the whole pretty well off in terms of agriculture, and one on fisheries where certain sectors of it are well off. Then there is not that government guarantee to move to take that funding of EMMF straight on to 2022. I hope I'm wrong on that, but I've certainly not seen that is any different. I welcome the fact, and I think the Minister mentioned this will come through in a future SI, that the scope of the energy of the EMMF will include energy efficiency measures, excellent, and working conditions. That seems to me a good amendment that perhaps we see or that's how it describes it in the explanatory memorandum. Having said that, the Minister may be aware that the European Union itself has been looking at the EMF regulations, and it has recently published the amending regulation number 508/2014, amending regulation as regards certain rules relating to the EMMF by reason of the withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the Union. And what the rest of the European Union is allowing is for EMMF to be used where it's necessary to compensate communities when they have been excluded from UK waters for fishing. And I ask the question because fishing by the UK fleets in other EU waters yields 94,000 tonnes of fish at a revenue of 106 million on average each year. then would the government consider a similar, not reciprocal, because it can be done unilaterally from both sides, as the EU is, would Britain have or consider having a similar scheme for those communities that are particularly hit by the fact that certain types of fleet and certain fisheries are now will be excluded from might be excluded from access if there's not a proper agreement in future. I think that would be particularly useful. But I'd also be interested to understand whether these EMF funds will in future still be equally open to a sector of the British fleet that are known as quota hoppers that are owned by foreign EU businesses. Will they have a significant proportion of operations, both Spanish-owned and Dutch-owned? And I presume they will have equal access post-Brexit to these funds in terms of non-discrimination within a UK single market. But I would be interested to hear the Minister's reaction to that. In terms of devolution, this is my last question really on the fisheries side. At the moment, the Marine Management Organisation acts on behalf of DEFRA for the whole of the country, although it only administers the English proportion of this. I presume, under devolution, under the new UK system, that the devolved authorities will take full control of these funds and that the MMO will be relieved of that duty. I think that would be useful to understand. And lastly, my Lords, which is rather a broader issue, and I was quite surprised to see it in the explanatory memorandum, it mentions the European Investment Bank. And I can't imagine that the European Investment Bank, which usually doesn't get out of bed for anything under about £5 billion or €5 billion, it says that perhaps that these, within this context, that the EIB money will no longer be available once we leave the European Union. Well, I find it interesting that it's in this EM, but having said that, it then goes on to say, and this could be or will be replaced by, quote, domestic finance mechanisms. My Lords, I have heard nothing from the government in terms of the billions of pounds and euros that is invested, particularly in environmental areas, by the European Investment Bank, of what's going to replace that. It seems to me the government now has some clue about that, and I'd be very interested to hear from the Minister what that is.
I thank the Noble Lord the Minister for his explanation of the orders before the committee today, and I declare my interest as stated in the register as being in receipt of EU funds. As the Noble Lord the Minister has said, these orders are amendments to retained EU laws to allow the rural development programmes and other programmes supported by a combination of UK and EU funding to continue to operate after EU exit for the remainder of the 2014-2020 programming period. The government has guaranteed that the government has guaranteed that projects will be funded for their full lifetime and has gone further by pledging to commit the same cash total in all funds for farm support, including the Common Agricultural Policy, until the end of this Parliament, expected in 2022. All the orders were originally negative instruments that one or either houses or both sifting committees have recommended be debated by Parliament. Your Lordship's Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee, Subcommittee B, in its ninth report expressed disappointment at the uninformative nature of the explanatory memorandums that provided no explanation of the different instruments' discrete functions. On my analysis, the first two memorandums on rural development are the same verbatim, word for word except the title. In its 18th report, the committee also commented that the provision of more financial information would have been more useful to inform debate. The second two sets of instruments on EU structural funds are also very similar and are more informative, providing some details on the value of EU funds to be replaced. While it is recognised and appreciated that the government has accepted the committee's recommendations, why has so little information been provided through these explanatory memorandums. Other than funding originating from the UK government and several commission roles being domesticated, are there any significant changes that will result from the enactment of these NIs in a no-deal scenario? While the orders appear largely technical, it is rather intricate to appreciate the amendments from the legal texts. I have also one or two questions for the Minister to clarify exactly what is happening here. First, my Lords, these orders transfer obligations or discretions from Member States to relevant authorities, and these will be pertinent to each devolved administrations. I'm sure the Noble Lord the Minister will confirm each devolved administration, probably excepting Northern Ireland, has been in discussion and is in support of these orders. Each devolved programme has also consulted with a programme monitoring committee, which is composed of stakeholder representatives, including non-government organisations. Under the rural development orders, no further details are disclosed. Under the Structural Investment Fund orders, there is further information that DEFRA has met with the Rural Payments Agency's Industry Partnership Group, and these stakeholders are named. Could the Noble Lord the Minister clarify the extent of the consultation and the full extent of the consultees at devolved level? Have the commensurate stakeholders as named in the IPG UK list been consulted at devolved level, that is the Welsh, Scottish and Northern Ireland representatives of farmers, consultants and agents? While there may have been no possible consultation with the Northern Ireland office, it would be useful to know that stakeholders have been consulted in that region. Under regulations pertinent to the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, EMFF, no details regarding stakeholders are given, other than there was targeted engagement. Quote, could the Noble Lord the Minister clarify what targeted engagement amounts to and specify exactly which stakeholders were involved? These details would be most informative as your Lordships prepare for the Fisheries Bill, which is promised soon. Secondly, at paragraph 2.6, it is explained that some regulations are being addressed separately by the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. The split between departments does lead to confusions. Could the Noble Lord the Minister clarify whether ESI, that European Structural and Investment Funds under paragraph 2.8, come under his department or BEES? Furthermore, an explanation regarding the European Investment Bank, as the Noble Lord Teverson has mentioned, and its relevance to these orders would be helpful, as it is stated at 12.1 impact that the UK's involvement in the EIB will cease on EU exit. The paragraph continues that domestic finance mechanisms would still be accessible. I'll be most grateful to understand, like the Noble Lord Teverson, what this refers to. What are these mechanisms and how they will operate in regard to these orders, and indeed who might be those finance providers? There is mention under the structural orders at paragraph 7.5 that projects under both the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development, EAFRD, and EMFF, the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, previously mentioned, whose funding has been agreed before the end of 2020, will be funded for their full lifetime. My Lords, how long would that be? I'm a little confused that projects post-leaving the EU, especially under a no-deal scenario, that have not yet been endorsed at EU level until 2020, will still be guaranteed by the government. But let us stick to the convenience for now that it will be March 2019 in which we will be leaving. Could the Noble Lord the Minister clarify the apparent contradiction? And the Noble Lady Baroness Mackintosh also raised queries in this regard, and whose budget will be responsible in which circumstances. I'm grateful to the Noble Lord the Minister for the consultations he has undertaken with all benches on these orders. They have been most helpful, and his written replies to our questions previously on other orders have been most helpful. but I apologise to him that it was not possible for me to meet with him this week, and that subsequently I have not been able to give him notice of my inquiries today. I would like to know how the Minister's Department intend to manage agricultural and rural development support through these exit regulations and no doubt CAP regulations to come next week, with full funding to 2022 and subsequently to the provisions of the Agriculture and Fisheries Bill. These support measures are indeed vital across the rural economy. His department has included features of this landscape at paragraph 7.5 of the explanatory memorandum under the Rural Development Orders. This explains that new RDP will cease, while the same cash total in all funds for farm support, including the Common Agricultural Policy, no doubt, will continue until the end of this Parliament, still expected to be 2022, my Lords, even though the noble lady Baroness Mackintosh is quite entitled to reflect otherwise. The CAP is at a total funding of £3 billion per annum, and under paragraph 7.7 at the structural orders, it is not entirely clear what the total or annual value of the funding of the EU commitment to scheme holders will be and for what duration of time. I'd be most grateful if the noble Lord could give any further explanation beyond those given in his introduction in this respect, and what lines in the financial implications is, and that there are only 3 lines in the financial implication included in this is much to be regretted. I'm sure the noble Lord the Minister will also be aware of modulation, whereby deductions from payments under Pillar 1 are made and subsequently transferred to Pillar 2, Rural Development, and that these sums must be matched by the Government. Will the full administration of all these features still operate under the CAP towards rural development and be guaranteed by the Government? It is looking that there may well be a period of a gap before rural development is reinvigorated through the Agriculture Bill, and once again the noble Lord Teverson has drawn attention that could well be nothing for fisheries. I may be asking for far more than the noble Lord the Minister could possibly undertake under the orders today, especially if he was to undertake answers towards the very pertinent questions of the noble Baronesses of Byford and Lady Mackintosh. However, I am sure his full explanation, as far as possible, will be greatly welcomed across the industry. With that, I'm pleased, my Lords, to approve the orders before the committee today.
My Lords, I'm most grateful for what has been, I think, a very valuable debate and consideration beyond what, as we all know, are the technical requirements of why we need to do this. And I fully appreciate that many of us have been waiting and wanting to get on with some primary legislation, but that is not in my gift, alas. But I'm fully looking forward to having the sorts of, if it's my privilege to do so, the sorts of discussions, both in the chamber and beyond, in how do we take forward with the fishing, marine interests and agriculture and the produce that we create in our waters and on our land, which is so important not only for domestic production but of course for exports. These instruments, as I say, ensure that the rural development programmes and the maritime and fisheries operational programmes continue to operate effectively. As I've said, the Rural Development Fund is worth some £430 million per year, and the Marine Fisheries Fund is worth some £32 million a year, and I'm sure the noble Lord Teverson at this point is saying, gosh, that looks like a big gap. But I know, and I think that was very generous of the noble Lord to raise the fact that the fund, they have been such good custodians of other people's money. And as I've said again, and I will try and get as much detail to this as possible, the government has guaranteed that any projects funded from the 2014-2020 allocations from these funds will be funded for their full lifetime. So whatever is agreed up to the 2020 period, if thereafter those projects, those allocations are funded, they will be honoured. And as I say, my noble friend Lady Mackintosh opened with, obviously, where's the money coming from? And of course the Treasury allocates to departments, and my advice would be on applications is that Her Majesty's Treasury funding is a guarantee cover of all rural development projects entered into before the end of 2020 for their full lifetime. And I think, again, I would encourage those who are minded to think very strongly of those words of a Treasury guarantee. My noble friend also raised this, and I've declared my farming interests, and we all would like as much certainty as possible. It's precisely why the promise that, and I use the words as far as is possible, and I will seek to clarify that, of guaranteeing the same funds, same level of funds till 2022. What we all know, and there'll be noble lords who will wish completely the reverse. I have no doubt, no idea as to whether this Parliament will go on till 2022, and as we all know, no Parliament can bind its successors. But this was a promise while this government is in office and has that responsibility. That was their, what I would call, promise to the rural community, that we would honour the level of funds until the end of this Parliament. But none of us here are, I think, in a position to know precisely when that Parliament may conclude or not, or go to its full time. On the question of, and my noble friend again, Lady Mackintosh, raised the legal basis for reimbursement and the date. It is because the EU are bound by the regulations while they apply to the UK as a member state. Any commitments the UK has entered into prior to exit are commitments made from the EAFRD, and that is the basis of that. And of course, again, as to the date of leaving, but it's why it was that date in Article 50, and why precisely that the Treasury guarantee kicks in for anything after the date of us leaving. A number of noble lords raised the issue of the linkage of the Agriculture Bill, my noble friend Lady Mackintosh, the noble Baroness Lady Bakewell, in terms of these matters. And as I say, these SIs are made under the Withdrawal Act. They allow us to correct deficiencies. The purpose of the Agriculture Bill, upon which we are waiting, is obviously to provide the opportunity to redesign our approach to agricultural support, so that indeed, if we wish through the bill, we amend retained EU law, which we are bringing back now. So any amendments that we make are, yes, probably in the short term, and they will be probably to see how we might improve the current arrangements and to give better experience to agreement holders. Under Clause 1 of the Agriculture Bill, the Secretary of State may provide financial support for managing land or water in a way that protects or improves the environment. And of course, as we design our agricultural policy, we will be looking to see, and I think this is a point I'd like to put to my noble friend Lady Byford, we will be looking to see how we can support bringing together groups who work together in the agricultural sector. Clearly, as we look at how we enhance the environment, how we deal with landscape, is clusters, catchment area concepts. I think of slowing the flow in Pickering, to my noble friend Lady Mackintosh. All of this is where working together in schemes, I think, is going to be very rewarding in terms of enhancing the environment and, of course, producing very good food as well in that context too. I would say to the noble Baroness, my noble friend Lady Byford, I'm delighted the House of Commons said that we should have a debate on this. I think my understanding is because, of course, future funding for the points that Noble Lords have made is that future funding is important to rural communities and marine communities. And I would say also to the Noble Lord Teverson, on the 10th of December 2018, the government committed to providing £37.2 million of extra funding for the UK seafood sector for projects approved during 2019 and 2020 to boost the industry as indeed we become an independent coastal state. On the points, and again, I think I have raised quite a bit about the agriculture bill, but again, rural growth, which includes the Leader scheme, is currently included in the Rural Development Programme, so will continue under the government guarantee until the end of the programme period. Beyond that, the expectation is that rural growth initiatives will be supported through the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and this is intended to deliver for all parts of the country, but importantly, and wearing the rural proofing strong element, is that DEFRA is working with the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government to develop the ways in which it will support the rural economy. And perhaps I could cut in here and immediately say to the Noble Baroness Lady Bakewell on the rural strategy, I was fortunate enough to give evidence with the Secretary of State, and I think the Secretary of State has said publicly that he would, on the matter of the rural strategy, he's very much looking forward to the report of our Select Committee, and that might be an occasion to respond. So I think he generously was saying that as Noble Lords who were in that committee, that this was something that's raised, and as I said, I know the Secretary of State and I will be looking forward very much to the rural economy report whenever it comes out. On the questions of reporting, the Noble Baroness Lady Bakewell asked about reassurances on this. I can assure your Lordships that the level of rigour currently applied to ensure that the Rural Development Programme achieves value for money and overall public benefit will continue. Inspections will still take place, annual implementation reports will continue to be produced and approved, and programmes can continue to be evaluated administratively by relevant authorities. Of course, the National Audit Office will continue to be involved to maintain existing levels of scrutiny and good practice. We have put in place arrangements to ensure that the Commission's functions are now taken up by each devolved authority or the Programme Monitoring Committee, which is composed of representatives of environmental, rural and agricultural stakeholders, including non-government organisations. On the question of EMF and new replacement work schemes, which work schemes and how that will work, the Noble Lord Teverson raised this. In the Fisheries Bill, we're proposing a power to replace, modernise and broaden the existing grant-making powers in the Fisheries Act 1981. This will provide greater flexibility and ensure that new grant schemes can deliver value for money. Fisheries is devolved, and once we leave the EU, and on the closure of the EMFF grant scheme, devolved administrations have indicated they would want to run their own grant schemes targeted towards their own national priorities, and that is the position there. Where is fishing sport after 2020 in the Noble Lord Teverson? The government have made a commitment to replace EMFF from 2021 across the UK for the next 2 years. As I've said, there was an announcement, and this extra EMF will be available to UK licensed vessels. On the issue of the European Investment Bank, which the Noble Lords Grantchester and Teverson raised, the European Investment Bank currently has no involvement in the UK Rural Development Programmes or the Maritime and Fisheries Programme. Treasury funding will still be accessible to those seeking funding. Perhaps I should say Treasury funding, perhaps that sort of clarifies it. The impact on agreement holders will therefore be negligible. And indeed, I'm bound to say the loss of access to the EIB as a result of exit and not as a direct result of this instrument.
Can I just say to them that my Fisher's friends in Mevagizi did not have the European Investment Bank as highest of their priorities. So, I'm glad he's managed to clarify.
I thank the Noble Lord. On the issue of, I think I have dealt with that, which is again about further financial assistance. The Noble Lord Grantchester raised about, in effect, the different areas where governments are engaged within the same area in terms of the regulations. And we are working closely with the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in developing these instruments. The European Rural Development Fund and the European Social Fund have domestic powers to continue making payments following exit. This is not the case for the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development and the European Maritime Fund, European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, which are reliant on the spending powers in the EU regulations. I think that shows the distinction. So different approaches are therefore necessary to allow the funds to continue operating under the Treasury guarantee. On the issue of also the Noble Lord Grantchester, in effect, the provisions, why don't the provisions with the application the European Rural Development Fund and European Social Fund and Cohesive Fund, the regulations as they apply to these funds are being addressed in a separate SI by the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Indeed, this SI and other regulations will be developed in your Lordship's House on the 14th of March. On the issue, I'm sorry the Noble Lord of Grantchester and other Noble Lords may have observed on the lack of detail on the explanatory memorandum originally. We must all try and do better, of course, but the government has accepted the committee's recommendations, updated the explanatory memorandums before laying the SIs as affirmative, and indeed the committee generously welcomed the revisions of the EMs which met the committee's concerns. On the issue of consultations, I think I have got some words on that. No, I'm going to go for the back. I've got somewhere about the consultations, which is most important. The Noble Lord of Grantchester raised about consultations. On rural development, on the 25th of September 2018, DEFRA met the Rural Payments Agency Industry Partnership Group, as advised. The stakeholders present: Tenant Farmers Association, Countryside Land and Business Association, Farming Community Network, Institute of Agricultural Secretaries and Agents, British Institute of Agricultural Consultants, National Farmers Union. There was a subsequent meeting held on the 26th of November 2018 between the DEFRA and the Rural Payments Agency, IPG, as detailed above, updating stakeholders further on legislative progress in preparing for exit. On fisheries, a targeted engagement was carried out on the approach to amendments involving key stakeholders from the fisheries sector, food industry and environmental non-governmental bodies. In addition, a 10-week consultation was conducted through the Fisheries White Paper. So far as the devolved administration is concerned, these instruments have been developed in collaboration with officials in Scottish and Welsh devolved administrations and the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs. They have the discretion to consult with their stakeholders as it is already, it is of course a devolved matter.
Press the Noble Lord, just to clarify that a little bit more, is he saying therefore that it was a devolved administration's responsibilities to consult with their stakeholders rather than DEFRA in its wider powers of consultation?
I would say that DEFRA has very good relations and has dialogue with a number of the rural and fisheries organisations across the devolved administrations. But I think it is right to say there is a sensitivity if the responsibility is of a devolved administration, I think, to appear to be overhauling that would, I think, I don't think would reflect well, and so it is a matter for the devolved administrations. But clearly, we wish to work collegiately and.
In terms of how it then relates to how it's reported to us in the explanatory memorandums, that we do know there has been full consultation in all the regions as well as on a UK-wide basis.
If I have anything of specific detail, I will let the noble lord know precisely, because I think it may be helpful if I can glean some information on devolved consultations with stakeholders. I think that would be helpful. What I would say is that the key stakeholders that we have been engaged with on fisheries stakeholders were supportive of the work being undertaken. Indeed, on rural development, no concerns were raised by stakeholders who expressed actually their appreciation that work was being undertaken. My Lords, I'm going to look at Hansard because there are a number of points. My noble friend Lady Byford asked about youth and retirement projects and about issues to do with contractors and other matters. All I'd say is what this is designed to do is to continue with the arrangements that we have, but with the payment after we leave by our guarantee that we will fulfil the funding of any schemes that are applicable at the moment. This is not, obviously, as my noble friend knows, about future schemes when we will have all sorts of discussions. Whatever is appropriate now under these funds is obviously going to be, people could apply until the funding ends, till the programme ends, and so forth. But I think that a lot of what has been discussed, I will, if there's anything further that I think would be helpful to your lordships, but I do recommend these instruments, and I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Contrary, not content. The contents have it.
Rural Development, Rules and Decisions, Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2019, Lord Gardner of Kimball.
I beg to move.
Question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Contrary, not content. The contents have it.
European Structural and Investment Funds Common Provisions, Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2019, Lord Gardner of Kimball.
Lords, I beg to move.
Question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Contrary, not content. The contents have it.
European Structural and Investment Funds Common Provisions, Rules, etc., Amendment, etc., EU Exit Regulations 2019, Lord Gardner of Kimball.
Lords, I beg to move.
This motion be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Contrary, not content. The contents have it. My Lords, that completes the business before the Grand Committee this afternoon. The committee stands adjourned. So this jokey bit has finished.